Hey guys, how are you doing? Okay, it looks like we are recording automatically, so hello everybody. I forgot to turn that off. Usually I take a moment or so before I start the recording. Whoops, I was just editing that. Let's go over to chat. It looks like with GoToWebinar, if you don't unset it to start recording, then even if you tell it not to record on start, it still does. So you get to watch me drink coffee for a moment on on the recording. How's everyone doing? I posted a couple of questions one that I said I'd address from last time, and then one on my chat. Hey everyone, hey Brian, hey Fletch, and Janine and Bryn. Great, a lot of enthusiasm today and attendance, which is very fun because should be able to start incorporating a bit more chat. I would like, no one's complained or anything, but of course I like to do that. Um, and I'm thinking that I'm really excited to do this webinar. The last two webinars, which are also like the first two in the Law of Implication Explained series, um, some way to close this. There, that's good enough. Um, so um, in the first two webinars, I wanted to get a certain amount of groundwork in. They're like, I've done past series where like the biggest one I did was called Alchemy, where there was 30 webinars. They went almost 3 hours, and sometimes they went over 3 hours, so not just almost. And for a while, I talked about, it was a very compelling series. It had incredible results and a great reception and so forth. But I spent a while before I got to what I got to last time in last webinar, which was the method about how to know what's true, just kind of giving a pretty clear indication of what that is. There's different ways for me to theoretically go about explaining law of implication stuff. And there's no like ideal way that I figured out, right? Because what we're needing to do is break people's very foundation of their thinking before kind of making forward progress in a certain way of looking at it. So with what I did last webinar, where I just came out and explained about how to know what's true, we're still not going to be able, especially new people, aren't really going to be able to follow that or apply it particularly well. After this webinar, there should be good progress towards that. So again, I either sort of set things up well for a while, and then you'll get more out of what I covered last webinar, but then it means I have to spend several webinars saying like, when I get to showing you how to know what's true, and then in this case, I just kind of came out and showed it, and not that there's any problem with revealing it or anything, but the main thing is it's hard to really see or follow or use or understand very well. Again, this isn't from any feedback I've gotten. It's just pretty likely to be correct in my opinion. But it's going to be hard to use. I wouldn't want to have like died after if I had just given last webinar. I don't mean to be morbid. I think about that only in the sense of getting stuff out there that's really urgent. Just anything could happen. And so I'm in fine health and I'm careful with my injuries and accidents and so forth. So there's nothing on the horizon that I'm aware of. But after this webinar, then if I got hit by a bus, then it isn't like there's like one big revelation or whammy I have for you in this webinar, but just one more webinar of kind of practice and looking also at the alternatives or opposites or the default way that people use to try to think about what's true or assume away will help us to see what we talked about last time by contrast, right? It's kind of hard to see something without contrasting it with something else. And I did a little bit of contrasting in the last webinar, but we'll do more of that. We'll do more using of it and so on and so forth. Mike Long said, I just dropped a commemorative PDF in the handout window of GoToWebinar for those attending live. Thank you, Mike. Awesome, commemorative PDF, LOI Success 3, and Mike's been doing some fun and great graphics that he even pays for himself. So we really appreciate that. And by we, I don't mean the royal we, but very many people have expressed appreciation in various ways for what Mike's doing. Hey, Marcus, great to have you. Great to have, wow, so many hellos and enthusiasm here. Let me go to the slides for just a tad, and then I'll do some questions, and we'll kind of go back and forth, and I'll get to the ones that I posted, the questions and so forth. All right, so just one little random overview, not even overview, but just random comments. So again, we're sort of applying things today, getting in, there's no structure that is automatically right or critical. I'm going to impose a little bit of structure or some paradigm shifts that I'll show you that are kind of central to law of implication, but they're a little bit arbitrary. But they're, in a sense, they're more like to help you remember and organize our thoughts. But you'll see. So I just wrote here, though, we're so used to needing to get so many details right. So I'm talking about a paradigm shift from like the normal way of thinking, so to speak, to law of implication. And one encouraging thought to start things off is that we're so used to needing to get so many details right in order to succeed. Whether or not we think of it that way, right? It's like, what's that feeling of overwhelm, or you're in a relationship and you're dissecting what the other person said to you and trying to figure out exactly what to say back or how to respond, right? Or you're in a relationship and they did something and you're like, well, what should I do? And what does that imply? It implies that getting all these details right is critical to success, right? Like if you make one or more missteps, then it's like, oh no. Or you're doing business and there's an appearance of a setback or something isn't going right, you're trying to learn some software and it's not happening as quickly as you or your mind had kind of subliminally decided was how quickly it should happen, and it feels upsetting, right? All those little instances point to an overall kind of subliminal philosophy, right? That we just have to get so much stuff right in order to succeed in stuff. Because otherwise we wouldn't get worried when little things go wrong, right? If we didn't feel like we had to get them right, or at least that it was going to cause us a lot of struggle and effort and annoyance and resources and or negative emotions in order to work through those things, right? So we're so used to that, and we don't need to go through life that way, and it's unbelievably nice and different to fully get over that, to when you fully transition and make the paradigm shift. It was captured one day in a conversation I've alluded to in the past that I had with Mike Long. It was quite early. It was probably a year and change, or a year-ish into us starting OMG. So that would have been around 2013 or so. And I said, I think it was probably early 2013, but who knows, right? Sometimes our memories are a little off. But there was something going on that both of us were kind of tempted. I don't even remember what it was, but just like some little thing, maybe an affiliate kind of not promoting the way that they should or whatever, right? But I said to Mike, I said, we need to stop thinking that like everything I touch, this might sound a little arrogant, but it subsequently came pretty much true. But it's based on methodology. It's not based on me thinking I'm awesome, what I'm about to say. I said, we need to stop thinking and acting as if everything I touch doesn't turn to gold, right? And again, it's based on the method, because I already had so much of this methodology for years prior to that moment. And applying the basic law of implication methodology that's rooted in seeking understanding, right, as progress, right? The real magic of compound interest comes when you seek understanding about seeking understanding, right? That's where the real amazing compound interest comes in life. And then all that had come from that at that point, right? I'd already gotten so much compound interest on doing that for years up until that moment that I'd figured out so many things and had made like a number of critical paradigm shifts so that life was really pretty easy. It didn't always, feel easy because I hadn't fully made all the shifts. I still haven't, right? But yeah, but this is an indication and an encouraging idea and I gave some examples of succeeding, right? To having a great relationship, crushing a project, meaning, succeeding really well on a particular project of whatever sort, including some project involving, with your kids that you want to do this or that with them, getting through your day, right? It's like sometimes we feel like there's just so many details we have to get right just to get successfully through the day, right? Or be happy, right? Just in general, proving a case, where you're trying to convince someone of something or whatever, or even how to vote or whatever, right? That there have to be all these details, right? All the 24/7 cable news implies that there's, it's like that every single day, there's all these details, right? And that people have this kind of feigned or real outrage about this or that or whatever. But really, all these things can really come down, as I write in the next sentence, you often only need to quote unquote struggle, and you don't really necessarily need to struggle even for this, but to the extent that you need to struggle in the first place, or at least break outside of a box or have a breakthrough, you often only need to struggle to get one thing or maybe a small amount of things. There's often a one or a small number of breakthroughs, for example, that you need to get right. And then there are a lot of details that, of course, you need to do right rather than especially like catastrophically wrong. But those details will tend to fall in place kind of effortlessly and automatically, or semi-automatically or whatever. That's what I mean by flowing from there. For example, whatever it is that you need to get right to start with in a relationship, including in your own mind, and whatever one or more paradigm shifts have to be there, or selecting the right partner for you, that sort of thing, and understanding what that means and how to do it and such. Obviously, if you then got every detail wrong after that, then that would be a major problem, right? But that isn't really going to happen when you have the right shift, right? Only once you're in the right box, then only like things that are pretty much going to be helpful fit in the right box, right? Conceptual box, so to speak. And then I wrote all of our paradigm shifts that I'm gonna give kind of 4 categories of paradigm shifts about law of implication in a moment. And I say all of them will be rooted, remember, as kind of a reminder, they're all rooted in one ultimate paradigm shift, which is the idea of shifting to seeking understanding as progress on a small and large and ultimate scale. So overall in your life, you could say that you have one goal in one sense, or one method of going after your goal, right? You could say one goal is for everyone to be as happy as possible, right? In whatever true, real happiness is, that we want the most of that for people. That's one way to characterize like maybe an ultimate goal. But then your ultimate sense of progress for that would be seeking understanding. But then for any particular more narrow goal or sub goal or day-to-day thing or whatever, the fundamental paradigm shifts has to do with seeking understanding. And then, as I mentioned, prioritizing seeking understanding about seeking understanding itself. And then that's kind of at the root. And the 4 paradigm shifts will have to do with how we look at power, knowledge. I unfortunately put these slightly out of order to what I have coming up, but whatever. Power, knowledge, identity, and progress. So with knowledge, the paradigm shift, I'll list them here. I put colons here, but then I just decided to make separate slides for each one. So if we go to knowledge, for example, I just have some kind of notes and keywords. I'm going to go quickly here for a moment, but we're talking about making a paradigm shift from having our sense of knowing no longer rooted ultimately in what we feel like believing or what we feel like is true, especially when you really feel like it's certain has to be. That still is not the ultimate basis for our knowledge. And if you can know something but don't feel it, like you could come to understand clearly that God has to exist and the basic nature of God, whether what people will do right then, often by habit, is then check to see how they feel if it feels true. But then we're just reverting back. I mean, we still have maybe 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the paradigm shift that we're trying to make with knowledge, where ultimately we're not checking for a feeling to see if we know something. Instead, feelings matter, and associative thinking matters tremendously for raw material at every moment. If you didn't have associations, you wouldn't have memories, you wouldn't have a sense of what's important in the environment. You just kind of wouldn't have any forward motion or information or any raw material of any sort, in essence, to think, to feel, to want to do stuff, whatever. So it's super useful and great to have associative thinking, but it needs to not be the basis for your knowing, and therefore not the ultimate basis for your decision making, and so forth. So as you kind of pull on that string or thread, then you'll get everywhere else. Any one of these four paradigm shifts that I'm going to kind of allude to here. Of course, I can and will describe them more and more and more in the next probably several webinars. All right. So like it's not like this is the paradigm shift when I have on the slide, right? The slide is just a bunch of notes, right? So you can just delve into it more and more. But there's a paradigm shift that is indicated here that to the extent that it appeals to you, you can focus there, pull on that, and you'll get to everything else. Any one of these four works that way, which is pretty cool. I'll come back to the slide, but then just to go on. So power, right? Power also, I could have written free will, right? Like what's the basis for our free will and so forth. So power doesn't mean like you're, rubbing your hands together greedily like you're Dr. Evil or something like that. It's being interested in what limits your power in ways that it shouldn't, what would make you more powerful in practice, and so on and so forth. We could, these could overlap a certain amount. These aren't really automatically mutually exclusive or anything like that. They're just more of ways of thinking and angles that just let us see more depth on everything by having these angles. Then I'll go to the fourth one, which is like goals and success. That could theoretically overlap a little bit in your terminology with power, although I mean sort of a little bit different things by them. By power here, I mean like the basis for your power, because if you figure out the basis for your power, then that can lead to everything else in terms of leverage and accomplishment, right? And making a difference for other people, for everyone you love, right? Power may well mean the power to help them in all sorts of ways, right? Both mundane and kind of ultimate, and whatever. And so there's lots of good reasons to be interested in power, especially to the extent that we care about other people. Goals and success, you can make the same argument where, of course, you could have goals that affect other people, and once again, you'd want to all of these, again, lead to kind of the same ultimate place, but they're different angles. So goals and success, I would list here, and then identity. I'm actually planning on looking at identity as a bit of a priority in this webinar, I think, because there are some questions that touch on that and so forth. Identity is the pretty fascinating idea that you're not your mind, right? The idea of consciousness could, identity and knowledge sort of have some overlap, right? So the idea of consciousness, how that fits in, how is it that your mind is or isn't conscious? How do we know our mind is not conscious? I feel like someone's recently asked me that question. But if not, I've certainly been asked, and I'll look to explain and show better today. And let me remind you of last time we had these four, I split the method of knowing into 4 parts. And so what we want to do is continue to apply that. And I hardly, of course, applied it last time. And so we can take a look at how to know that your mind is not conscious, and it should be interesting and enlightening, a little bit further enlightening about how to think about things and how to use the method. Okay, let me go back to the chat. Ah, that's cool. Yeah, Mike remembers well that conversation about the things turning to gold. Dave says, I'm curious about getting around intimidation related to implying you're not your mind, including, for example, to others in the conversation. Okay. I can think of a few things you might mean by the second part of what you're saying. Maybe if you expanded that a bit, when I get to it, I'll take a look. A feeling of intimidation with yourself, not others intimidating you necessarily. Got it. Okay, great. All right, well, let's talk about that first. So there's two related questions. One is, how do you know that your mind is not conscious? which I get asked sometimes, a very valid question. And of course, and then what Dave is saying, like that you're not your mind. Oh, nice. I'm glad you like that about the conceptual box and things that are helpful. Good. The kind of the details tend to fall into place pretty simply. All right, so let's keep that question in mind. I'm going to go back off the chat for a second, and let's keep this slide from last webinar up here. All right, and let's use this. And I don't like go in order through these things necessarily. You'll see. We are trying to one of the big and maybe hardest, in my opinion, is it's one of the hardest. Who knows? Paradigm shifts with law of implication. And let me remind you, when I say with law of implication, the law of implication refers to something outside of itself that's real, kind of like with arithmetic or whatever. So it's not like you're trying to learn my teaching or my brand or whatever, or my opinions. It's that we're pointing to something real. And so it's a paradigm shift that has to be made regardless of the brand name law of implication. Everyone has to make the following paradigm shift, or else they can't, they're not really at square one with thinking accurately. They can think accurately within a perspective or box that they're already in, but they can't think accurately about their perspectives. Or basically, people can only think as accurately as their biggest box or the that, like, without what I'm about to say, a person could correctly look at and think about a conceptual box as long as they had another conceptual box or framework that they were given, or they absorbed, or their mind absorbed, whatever, that allows them to do that. But once they run into the limit of the conceptual boxes, the assumptions, the worldview, and so forth that they're given, once they'll hit a certain limit or a wall, and where they won't have a conceptual framework or box to fall back on to look at the next thing. For example, if someone's trying to think about evolution and they don't have they don't have a conceptual box that exists that they've been given to do that properly, that they can't do it unless they make the paradigm shift that I'm getting to, that has to do with being able to think about consciousness and think about your consciousness screen and so forth, and in a way that's right, rather than so the way that people do by default, which is wrong and to be simplistic, is like now that we have computers, it's kind of fairly easy to illustrate. Suppose you and your child are sitting there together and you're looking at a computer screen, and there's a game, and in that game there's like a grass field with a fence and there's cows in it, right? Such as I've been playing Minecraft recently with my son. But so again, you're sitting there with your son, you're looking at you're of course looking at your computer screen, it's a game, but you're looking and you're trying to find the cows, all right? And you're looking, you're like, oh, there's the cows, all right? And it's totally reasonable to say, well, there are the cows, right? And then you might have little people that you're controlling, and you might say, okay, so go over to the cow and use the bucket and get some milk or whatever. And that's all completely reasonable. It makes perfect sense, and so forth. The paradigm shift that people need to make is metaphorically to be able to also understand that they're looking at a screen. So normally when it comes to a computer screen, that's easy to do. It's easy to both understand that you're talking within the world of the game you're looking at on the screen. That makes perfect sense, right? And then it's also very reasonable to say, of course, we're actually really looking at a computer screen. This is all happening on a computer and we're looking at the screen, right? Okay, so you can look at it from with either perspective when it comes to a computer. And we would need to be able to do that with real life, so to speak. And what I mean is, when you look around you right now, it feels like you're not looking at a computer screen. Or anything metaphorical to that. It feels like you're just metaphorically looking at the cows, and the cows are there, and you are your body, and you're interacting with those cows, and you're thinking about those cows with your mind and the visual processing of your mind plus your eyeballs and so forth, plus physics, are giving you an image of the cow, and et cetera, et cetera. We need to be able to make a conceptual shift where we're also at times, when appropriate, able to step back and say, it seems like I'm seeing cows. But this is important now, because then you're going to start to ask, well, what do you mean? Are the cows really there? Are you saying they're not there? The shift involves being able to be aware that you seem to see cows, you seem to be your body touching the cow and so forth, if in real life you're on a field with cows. You need to be able to think about it in terms of it seems that way, without worrying one way or the other about whether there really are cows, or even whether the image that you're seeing of the cows is really of the cows, or if it's a representation of the cows, or any of that. In other words, to go back to the computer screen analogy with looking at your game with your son, so on the one hand, you want to be able to talk within a game and say, okay, go over to the cows and stand there, and they need to understand that, and that's well and good for playing the game. And then if you were to say, of course, we're looking at a computer screen, and even separate from talking to your son, if you could just conceptually yourself realize, stepping back, okay, we're looking at a computer screen. In order to understand that you're looking at a computer screen, you really don't actually need to have a full conceptual framework for how the cows are real relative to the computer screen, or how they seem and so forth, right? We could then think about that. Okay, so what are the cows really? Are they computer code? Well, it doesn't seem like they're only computer code, right? Because they seem to do more than just sit there as a bunch of ones and zeros, right? They move around, they seem to make mooing sounds, right? And so forth. But so it's actually complicated. It's doable, but complicated and extraneous in a certain sense to worry about the relationship. I want you to be able to think about that you're looking at a computer screen without worrying about the relationship of the computer screen to the cows. And just be able to say, yeah, I'm looking at a computer screen. It does seem like there's cows and a field and stuff on the computer screen. We could use that as a basis for thinking about code, as I said, and perception and representation and how the physical world works and so forth. But we can't do any of that until we get started. And so I want to distinguish getting started thinking about our consciousness screen and the idea of seems as distinguished from what is. I want to distinguish getting started from then figuring it all out. We could separately discuss figuring it out. What is the real world? What is the material world? How does it relate to our mind and so forth? But instead, we want to be able to think just about our consciousness screen in a weirdly simple way. And how does this relate to our mind and consciousness? All right. So what's going to happen is we're going to constantly be tempted to import additional quote unquote knowledge in as we start to make our scenarios. And we want to learn to be vigilant to not do that. So what it's going to turn out that we're going to build, I also talked here on this slide that I talked about last webinar. I talked about how we build the definitions of our words with scenarios that get created in our consciousness field, that we pay attention to as existing in our consciousness field. It's going to be tempting to import existing definitions and our existing habits of defining concepts and words with other words. So we're so habituated to that, it'll get imported back. And partly, I'm stepping back here, partly in this webinar, I'm recording something for posterity, right? And this whole Explain series, but especially early on, I'm recording things for posterity that if something were to happen to me, you could rewatch and use it and get there. Even if you're not getting there immediately from what I'm saying, I'm giving enough clues and explanations that it's there for people if they need it. All right. So So when we talk about our mind not being conscious, the reason why we can have full confidence of that is because we're actually going to build the concept of our mind as a scenario, as something defined by a scenario in our consciousness field. It's the habit of then immediately associating that and concluding it as something out there that we don't know, that error is gonna make it confusing or cause us to ask the question of how do we know our mind is not conscious? You can know your mind is not conscious again because it's actually a concept that gets constructed, and it actually gets constructed as a conclusion. You're not just defining it based on nothing. So here, I'll show you. So we need to remember how to start out thinking. We start out thinking with reorienting, like about ultimate stuff, all right? Or whenever we're stuck about something, especially if it involves consciousness, then reorient yourself in the following way. Say, all right, I'm aware of my consciousness screen. I know that not because I can even delineate exactly or describe exactly what's on my consciousness screen, even at this moment. That's not how I go about knowing it. The way I know I'm aware of my consciousness screen is that I can stop right now and I can realize I'm not aware of everything. I realize someone could possibly ask the question, well, how do I know I'm not aware of everything? Well, any question, for example, that you can ask that you don't know, right? But it's really, you don't even have to prove it. You can just, it's so easy to act on the idea. What would you rather try to act on? The idea that you currently know everything there is to know, or that you don't, right? Like it becomes nonsense so fast, even if you get confused about proving that you're not omniscient. Again, the way that I can represent how to do it or try to explain is just think of anything that you don't know the answer to, and there you go, right? But even if that for some reason didn't work for you, then trying to operate on the idea that you already know everything is nonsense. You might as well just stop right now, right? Like there's no reason to do anything. You already know everything, right? It just kind of goes nowhere. So you don't know everything. You run into absurdities everywhere you try to go with the idea that you're already omniscient. And it's also not the case that you're aware of nothing. So you orient yourself to that you're neither aware of nothing, nor are you aware of everything. And by the way, that can form a logical tree of like something versus nothing, and then to see if that something could be everything or it could be not everything, right? So it's either something versus nothing, and then the something can either be that's the all, right? If I say I'm going to give you something, it could incorporate that I'm going to give you everything logically, or it could mean I'm not going to give you everything, I'm going to give you less than, right? So either it means everything or less than everything, or not everything. So when we have an exact set of knots, NOT, right, like that, like opposites, then we're being fully comprehensive, right? This, my four paradigm shifts, by contrast, of knowledge, power, identity, and goals, those aren't formed from a logical tree of like knowledge or not knowledge, and then not knowledge, like, you know what I'm saying? Like that would be how you go about forming 2 or 4 categories that cover everything, or 3 or whatever, is if you have a series of opposites that you delve into. Okay, because we're delving into a series of opposites with starting with consciousness screen and then saying, is it everything or not? Okay, not everything. So or sorry, or either you can go in either direction. You can start with everything or not, or you can start with nothing or not, and then you end up with some, neither all nor zero. So that's your starting point, is you're aware of something, and that has to be the starting point of whatever. Now you could notice that you are helped out by there's a coherence to your thoughts, right? It could be that there was total noise, that you're aware of something, but there's no coherence between the last moment and this moment. And that if that was the case, you wouldn't be able to think, there wouldn't be any connection with anything. And so your awareness would be totally pointless, basically. And literally, so there couldn't be any goals. You couldn't have any free will, nothing. So there's a coherence of some sort to your consciousness screen. Now, someone could be sort of a radical skeptic and say, well, maybe it just seems like there's coherence. But the thing is, there's a certain set of pieces of information or realizations you can have and so forth, where seems and is collapse to the same thing, which is terrific, right? Because without straying away from seems, without accidentally making conclusions that you shouldn't be making prematurely, staying within the world or realm of how things seem, there's a bunch of things that can be known nevertheless. So if things seem coherent, they can't seem coherent for a moment I'm asserting this, but then what do you do when you notice you're asserting something and you want to make sure that's clear? Then you look at the opposite, right? Could absolute noise seem coherent, right? How would you get any kind of coherence? How would you get the seeming ability of coherence without any coherence? Right? Can you imagine turning on a like a TV set with total noise, and then you can work on it, but if there was coherence, it would have to be imposed, on that if it was actual noise. If you knew ahead of time it was noise. If you turned it on for a friend and they seemed to be getting a whole bunch of meaning from something, then you would know that their mind was imposing it whole cloth on. If you knew that it was noise in some way. Anyhow, these things are kind of so obvious that I don't want to get bogged down in them. And if you're only going to get tripped up on them in kind of a useless philosophical pursuit, not the minute anything's practical, that you're really trying to solve an actual problem in life that you care about, you're not going to get bogged down in those things, which is an interesting little test, right? Another proof with the coherence of your thoughts is that, meaning when I say coherence, I mean that it isn't total noise, right? Like what you're aware of. It isn't like total chaos and just the same as looking at a TV screen of a channel that doesn't exist, right? Is that there would be no point to trying to think about anything anyway. So you might as well act on the idea that your thoughts are coherent. Because if you were experiencing total noise and somehow it wasn't, like, again, it's all impossible anyway, but there's nothing to act on if it's total noise, right? So you might as well operate as if there isn't. It's not true. And then that'll keep working, right? Like there's a massive amount of coherence to your life experience and your thoughts. If someone, again, there's like the punch in the face test, right? Like if someone punches you in the face, or if you punch someone in the face, there's no way either one of you is going to act on the idea that there's total chaos in your consciousness screen and there's no parallel between 1 second and the next. Okay, not to get, I did get bogged down there, but I'll continue. Not to get even further bogged down. So there's a coherence. In addition, there's a value to your experience. I could even make it's a little finicky when I right click here. Yeah. Make a slide. So what was I saying? What I'm referring to now, your consciousness screen, we could say awareness, right? Not all, not zero. Coherence between one seeming moment and the next, between your thoughts, between your expectations that if you take a step, you'll, it's another thing, you can just kind of test it out or whatever, but it's constantly the case that what you expect to happen will happen some of the time, like constantly, even if it's not all the time. You can get surprised and so forth. You could step on pavement that you thought was going to hold your weight or have friction, and it could be ice that was invisible, right? That happened to me the other day. But there wouldn't be any coherence with anything if there was no coherence. in general. And of course, there's just a tremendous amount of coherence. So this coherent, that's going to come in, that's going to be matter when it comes to mind. And then there's a value, or I can even put these together in the same line about your experience. Coherence and a value to your experience. The value, it means is about good or bad, right? There would also be no point to anything literally without your experience, your conscious experience having a value to it, meaning that you can tell the difference between someone you care about, which might be anybody in a sense, like, suffering horribly and getting tortured, versus something nice, or them getting a hug, or experiencing a nice love, that's reciprocated or whatever. You could tell the difference between those two things, right? And you could just basically tell the difference between feeling good or not feeling good, especially when it just boils down to seems, right? So an example of keeping it at the level of seems is like, if you eat a bunch, like a candy bar, and you enjoy it, then you still enjoy the experience of eating a candy bar, right? In terms of overall life strategy, you may want to get the best value of experience net, and to the best of your ability, you might want to try to do things now that also, on balance, will give you an overall benefit to your value of your experience later. So if you're going to feel sick later, or have weight that's going to be a problem in all sorts of other ways, or whatever, it may or may not be beneficial overall, or even a net positive to the value of your experience to eat a particular candy bar. I'm not obviously lecturing anyone on candy bars. I'm just using this as a simple example. But we want to be able to distinguish between, if I say, if in the moment eating the candy bar feels or gives you what seems like a positive value of experience, you can still assess that. You can still understand what that means. If you didn't have any value to your experience that was variable, if it was all exactly neutral, then there would be no motivation to do anything. There'd be no, you wouldn't understand even what I was talking about if I said that eating a candy bar felt good in the moment, right? Or does eating that, if I ask you a question, does eating that candy bar make you feel good in the moment? Then the fact that you can answer that, right? Now, it doesn't even mean that it's benefiting your body. It doesn't even mean that what's going on with your neurons, or whatever. Just if in your conscious experience, it just seems that it feels good, then that still is real in a certain sense, regardless of the existence of the candy bar or whatever, right? They could theoretically manipulate your brain. When I say they, I don't mean any actual theys. I don't mean that science is at this point yet. But suppose that there were scientists that could hypnotize you / stimulate parts of your brain, some sort of virtual reality where there's not even a candy bar that exists, but you feel like you're eating a candy bar, and you feel like that's pleasurable, right? In that instance, you would still be experiencing a positive value of experience, or one that at least you felt was positive and that you wanted to have more of if there was no cost to it, et cetera, right? So, and I go into some of these details here, or mental experiments too. I'm just practicing with you about separating the idea of just thinking about how things seem in your consciousness screen, or I could just say how things seem, right? In your consciousness screen is like some explanatory text, but it doesn't necessarily add any meaning. It just kind of clarifies or repeats. So what we want is practice with separating out the idea of how things seem from how they really are, or an actual candy bar or not, or whatever. So we have this variable value of experience. Given that fact, then we want the most net value of experience for ourselves, and that's when we can also start thinking about concepts that touch on love and caring or hate or whatever, where do we want to either not care one way or the other about other people's value of experience? And if we do care, would we rather want them to have a better value of experience or a less value of experience? And so I build a concept of love as opposed to liking something, right? If you like something, then that's based on the idea. And at this point, I'm blending together you and your mind for a moment, but it's based on your mind. It's an associative idea that your mind might give you. You might think about it and then conclude it, whatever is true. But liking would have to do with you associate a thing or a person or an event or whatever to something that furthers your goals, and or again, we get into an interesting twist situation I alluded to last webinar, where your mind, remember I talked about the dried milk, where taking the water out of milk and then you can re-add it in, right? If you had to go somewhere where you couldn't take the water part with you. Your mind, I haven't fully explained this or proven it necessarily, or gone through the proof of it yet, but skipping ahead, I can say if your mind is not conscious, but it turns out it's not. So your mind not being conscious can't experience any of your experience. So all the thinking that your mind does is somehow based on a different type of input, but that obviously somehow mirrors your experience in some way that's real, because your mind manages to make you feel like it's conscious and is aware of what you're aware of, and kind of teaming up with you. Of course, people don't even think of it that way. They think of them as their mind, and so forth. But it pulls that off very well. And so there's of course a great parallel. By the way, we can see this once again with a computer. In a sense, you can imagine it can seem like the computer is aware of what's on the screen, right? Like suppose you're playing a game and you're a guy and you're walking around a field and there's cows, and then a skeleton comes out with a bow and starts shooting you. It feels like that skeleton sees you, right, your computer character, and is shooting a bow at that computer character. So it kind of feels like the computer is seeing you and aware of the skeleton and aware of you and aware of the field and aware of the bow and the arrow, right? And it's making those things happen, or shooting, or the skeleton seems like it might have a mind and it sees you and it's shooting you, right? All those things seem that way, but that's not the case, right? There's computer processing going on that's like parallel to what you're seeing on the screen, but the computer itself doesn't see the screen and react to it. There's something analogous going on with your mind, where it doesn't see or experience your conscious experience. It doesn't actually feel good or bad about anything. What your mind does, skipping ahead a little bit, but just to kind of fill in some blanks that we can then look to prove or understand better. What your mind does is it has something like goals, and it gives you a sense of happiness when it perceives, in its way of perceiving, an event or something like an event that is associated with progress. See, your mind can't actually know anything, it just associates. So it can't give you a feeling of a good feeling, like a feeling of pleasure or happiness, based on actual progress towards a goal, because it doesn't know enough to know for sure that a particular event or action or whatever means actual progress towards a goal, right? Like you could feel great cruising along on the road towards a destination and be excited about reaching like Las Vegas, let's say. You're on the road, you're cruising, you feel great. Your mind is perceiving progress towards you getting to Las Vegas and having fun, right? Maybe you won't get to Las Vegas. Maybe you'll get, sorry, morbid again, but maybe you'll get in a fiery crash, or maybe you'll just get a phone call, something important with business, you have to turn around, right? So you might be making no progress at all towards an actual Vegas trip, but your mind perceives that you are and gives you happiness based on it until it perceives something different, right? You see? Same thing with relationships, right? There's all sorts of things that someone could perceive as getting them closer to a goal, or their mind kind of perceives in the way that mind perceives. Events come up that the mind calculates and associates are getting you closer to a goal. It then gives you a sense of pleasure and or happiness. But your mind itself doesn't experience that pleasure or pain if it perceives you to have a setback or be going away from a goal, right? So the mind doesn't feel pain, mind doesn't feel the happiness. You do. That's in your consciousness field. But you can measure in the brain, neurons firing off that are in parallel with that to some degree, or every degree, or whatever. But a major thing that I was talking around about there was giving kind of context around your mind itself not being conscious. Everything I just talked about was kind of helping to fill in more framework for you so that it becomes more thinkable, more real, more understandable, and you just have some practice with thinking about your mind as not being conscious. Because I was separating out. We normally kind of blur together us and our mind is thinking and seeing and so forth. And we talk about, we're saying like, well, I feel good, right? But people treat their mind and themselves as one kind of blurred entity. So then they talk about things that involve consciousness. I love this person, I feel this. Well, your mind doesn't feel, right? So people are kind of going back and forth in this kind of blurry, confused way. Now, a separate thing or original thing that I'm building towards here is that I mentioned is that I'm looking to show how you build the concept of your mind, or you build to where there's a concept there. You build a scenario out, and then there's a concept there. To stop for a second and talk about, well, what do you mean, David? Could you give an example of there's a concept there? Well, if you, to go to my idea when I think about government, where to help think about government, a scenario where there's like 10 people that manage to get stranded on an island. And then let's say 6 of them vote on something. Well, now a concept emerged, which are 4 people who are in the minority on that vote. And regardless of how they vote, they don't, or if they vote the other way, they don't get their way, right? So that's a concept that emerges. We can call those people the minority in that topic, or the minority dissenters regarding that vote or something, you see? So the concept emerged as we built the scenario. So your mind is an example of a concept that will emerge as we build on the scenario of our identity. So I'm kind of skipping here and there to fill things in as I kind of am in flow here. But the reason we're going to be able to know, like if someone were to ask, or if I were to pose the question, now that we've built this concept of a minority group, I don't mean racial minority, but just a minority group of voters regarding a particular topic. Let's say there's 6 guys and 4 girls, and there's a vote put up and by one person, seconded by another to go for vote. They vote on whether the men get to tell the women to do whatever, and then the women are not allowed to disobey, right? So now a concept emerges as like a minority group of dissenters, right? I put several words rather than one word to that, but we could, if we wanted to, we could come up with one word to capture that concept of those, in that case, 4 women. And it doesn't have to be, we could also make something where there wasn't a prior, in this case, I made it so that women are those 4 people. They could have also just made it so that they picked 4 people kind of arbitrarily and said, those people are going to be our slaves. Let's put that to a vote, right? The 6 of us get to be the authority figures, those 4 are the slaves, and we'll vote on whether we want that. And then so we can give a name, slaves, to those 4 people, or servants, or whatever. Now if I say our servants as a group is the group that I call servants, the concept, is that conscious? Right, now we could say, well, I don't know, the individual people are, right? But the group isn't. I kind of confuse things by picking a concept that involve people that might be that are conscious. We could go further and say, all right, let's say they somehow make they're advanced programmers and they make basically Bitcoin, right? That they can mine, and that can be their currency. Then is a particular Bitcoin that they make, is that conscious, right? And someone could say, well, how do you know it's not conscious? Well, we know for sure it's not conscious if it's just a concept that emerged from our scenario, because we're not saying that it has a counterpart in real life even. We're just making a scenario at this point. But when concepts emerge, those concepts are unconscious. Now that doesn't, there's still some potential objections or confusions that can come up, but let's go back now to our thread about identity. this is a very deep topic. So if I'm kind of a little bit skipping around, I'm certainly staying within the overall general topic, but I'm doing my best here. I understand it quite well though, but granted, if I were to practice this several times, I could probably make it a little bit more coherent. But anyhow, so the way that we arrive at mind is once we orient ourselves to here's this consciousness screen, and then we can of course define ourselves as the thing that's conscious of our consciousness screen. As we start to accumulate some things that we can notice, that we can eliminate the opposite of, which are things like the coherence of our consciousness screen and the variable value of it. Now we can put that together, and the coherence is going to allow us potentially to have some sort of free will. So the question that can come up is there anything that we can potentially do to affect the value of our experience, right? Furthermore, we can also skip to where we notice that we seem to be able to manipulate the environment. Whether we can or not is besides the point. We seem to be able to, and that seems connected to some things that affect the value of our experience, right? So if there's like what seems to be a table with some food on it, and we feel hungry, and we feel like the food will help, and so we reach out and eat the food, and then we feel like that seems nice, right? Then all of that seems to mean that we might have the free will to go and manipulate our bodies, right, and so forth. It turns out we're not even necessarily correct about that. We don't have direct free will control over our bodies in a whole number of ways. It seems like we do. So if it seems like we do, or to the extent that it seems like we do, when it seems like we do, then what's true is it seems like we do. We want to get used to thinking like that or separating that out. But if you were paralyzed, then all of a sudden it would seem like you didn't have the same control of your body that you took for granted previously. Furthermore, your body changes, right? So something that changes shouldn't be referred to as the exact same thing, and so forth. So as we start to think about, all right, so we're aware of the, we might just kind of need to get into perception and put a whole number of pieces together, because it's natural, like to feel like there's a bunch of pieces that have to be answered together here. And I haven't even thought through very clearly how much we can tease them apart, or how much we need to answer a number of questions at once before it all takes shape. So because I've done this, then I may or may not be able to kind of walk us through one by one. We might need to put in a few pieces at once. It might turn out that as we looked at it more closely and thought about it and tried to do this step by step, one at a time, we might be able to in retrospect. But I'll just do this the best I can, and we'll see where we end up. And we can always work on it. At least the information will get across. So I'll need to skip around a little bit and then try to fill in some gaps. So let's see here. So there needs to be there seems to be an environment. Right, like an outside world, external world. We can ask ourselves, well, and this is where we want to get in the habit of looking at opposites, just to kind of, as we start to think around things. What would it look like? Instead of asking, well, what's in the environment, or what is the environment? That's what people's instinct, right? Let's ask something else. Let's ask, what would it be like if there didn't seem to be an environment? And I actually haven't thought of it quite, I probably intuitively thought of it that way, but I don't know, I haven't practiced this exact angle. So I'm doing this kind of in flow here, right? What if we had this consciousness screen, right, that we have, but there didn't seem to be an external environment? Well, let's think about a computer game that's like single player for a moment. There is, in one sense, an external environment, but it doesn't involve other people like us that seem like us, right? So there could be an external environment, something that seems like an external environment that's devoid of anyone but ourselves, right? But it could be like it is now, where it feels like we need to discover the environment and we're very limited in our ability to manipulate the environment. We have to use our body to do it, right? But what if there was no body? What if there was just these, like, whatever we saw in our, felt like we saw on our conscious screen, and we could somehow manipulate it just by thought without having any body? What would that be like? And we can go down that road. I actually haven't thought of it that way before. But we could go down that road if we wanted to, right? And try to think about that. But things are not that way, right? It does seem like we have a body and there's an external world. And not only does it seem that way, but every time we act on that being true, constantly, not necessarily always, but once again, constantly, the theory that we have a body and we can manipulate the external world with it keeps working very well on a certain level, right? So it's pretty obvious that it seems like there's an external world and there's some sort of reality to it, because here's what's not happening, and here's something that I have thought through. We are not creating our sense of the external world ourselves, and yet there's a coherence to it. So when I look out the window or look in front of me or look around me, I'm not deciding what I'm going to see first somehow and then creating it and then I see it, obviously, right? It's nothing like that. When we do what feels like looking around the world, it just gets seen by us, but something else is doing it, right? Something else is making it. Again, much like in a computer game, I'm for sure not programming and making the screen look the way it's going to look each split second before it looks away, right? The computer is working and someone programmed it and I'm just playing it. And it's very obvious the difference, right? Than if I was programming it right before I was playing it or as I was playing it, right? So it's a huge difference. It's nowhere near close. No one would wonder about that, right? So for it to even seem like there's an external world, then there has to be something creating the basis for it. So suppose that you were hooked up to a virtual reality set and you didn't even know it, and you were walking around like a kitchen within a virtual reality world, and it felt like you could pick up a pot and pour some water in there, right, and so forth. And suppose it was like really advanced virtual reality. Then even though it's virtual reality, there's something that remains absolutely true, which is that someone has to be making it other than you, because you're obviously not making it, yet it keeps happening and it has a coherence to it and you're feeling it, right? So it actually doesn't matter how quote unquote real the external world is. It doesn't matter if you're mistaken about perception on various levels, or you're mistaken about the hardness. We learn at some point that most everything, every physical object is mostly empty space once you get down to an atomic level. But that doesn't change a certain other type of reality. It kind of adds more nuance to it, or more, whatever information about it, but it doesn't change the fact that the chair still seems hard. You're not gonna, right, like there's still a certain reality to it. Something is making the chair seem hard and like it's not full of empty space. Even if there's a coherent model that on another way of looking at it, it is empty space, right? There's got to be a way that they're both true in a certain way. In the same way that in a computer game, if your character can jump up on a log and jump up and down on a log, or jump down on the grass and the grass holds them up, then in one sense the grass is only made of computer code and pixels, right? But in another sense that's also real in its own way and useful, is the grass does hold him up. There's some physics engine of the game that says that when you jump up and you don't land in the middle of the air, but you land back down on the grass inside the game, right? Your character, or that if you jump up on a block or a log or whatever, then you land on that and you stay on that. There's some level at which that has to that's true because the coherence of it and such. So we have this external world that you're not creating. And it's relevant for our experience in some way. Now, if there were only, it's hard for us to try to remove. This is like when I talk about alchemical thinking, where we like try to put something in, remove it, or take one thing out and try to think about it in that way, like thinking about our mind without consciousness, as I did earlier. In this case, let's try to imagine what it would be like to experience the world if there were no mind. If we didn't have, and this is what I mean, there's something that we kind of take for granted where there's something more than just the external environment, because let me just say this following statement and then we'll examine it. Without a mind, without something that's individual to you, that's giving you some sort of what we might call a perspective on things, then you would have to either be aware of all of the external world at once as it is in some way, or aware of none of it. Because there couldn't be anything determining why you're aware of either part of it and or adding what we might call color to the external world, right? Like it's not just being aware of it or all of it or none of it. It's that we aren't even necessarily aware of the external world as it is. A little bit like, once again, let's go to the computer game example. A computer game, in one sense, is programming, right? What we can call it ones and zeros, or characters in a programming language, right? That makes up the computer game in a very valid and in one sense real, in one way real sense, right? Then there's an interface with that computer program. Let's actually think about something a little bit different than the program. There's because the computer runs the program, but there's a world that somehow exists in a certain sense within certain computer games, right? Right, like there's any game where you can make a character and play a character of some sort and run around in a world, right? Then the potential or actual for that world exists within the computer code. Now, sometimes what exists is a procedure or algorithm for generating a world at random, in which case a particular world is generated when you start the game and it's saved as part of the save game, right? But one way or the other, a world is generated at some point. And so there's a world that exists overall, or the procedure for generating more parts of it if it doesn't all get generated at once. But some world or chunk of it gets generated. And in some sense, it's there, it's real, it exists on some level. Not just the computer game itself, but the world within the computer game. Now, without some sort of character to serve as what's like a mind or mind and body or perspective, think about it. You could only experience, there'd be no way to experience just part of the world at a time, right? Even if your character was like a simulated camera that was flying around the world looking at it, you would need something to determine that you're looking at one part of the world, or else you'd have to either see the whole world at once or none of it. And even seeing it might be made possible in a certain way, right? Like there might be no color until and unless something about the character decides what color you see or something like that. So what it boils down to is there's an external world, but if there's only an external world, that's not enough to account for how we experience the world. So there has to be some kind of perspective, but more than that, because we also get conclusions about the world constantly without even hardly realizing their conclusions, right? As I pointed out, I think before, even the idea that when you look at a chair, the idea that it is a chair rather than just an unprocessed collection of pixels or whatever, right? But that's like a conclusion, or at least an association that we may or may not call a conclusion. But in a sense, it's a conclusion because it's like that is a chair, right? So there's the association to the word chair. There might be other associations that may or may not be at the front of your, put into your mind, but they're close by, like if it's made of wood or there's, it has paint on it or it's a certain color. So you're getting some sort of individualized perspective on the external world, and you are getting conclusions about the external world and various associations about what you're seeing, right, all at once, and memories, right, and so forth. So collectively, that would be our mind. Our mind would be attached to us in some way, but not physically, but like by whatever's making the whole thing, right? Something about the whole system is associating or attaching our mind to us, but I don't mean physically attaching, and I don't mean it's a part of us. I can attach a name to you. It doesn't mean that the name is like part of you in the same way that a hood is part of a car, right? Or a steering wheel is part of a car. So there's a mind that makes itself obvious in all sorts of ways. And there's an external environment of some sort that has regularities to it, some sort of code to it. And then there's a whole bunch of questions about how our consciousness stream, which seems on the surface, we get the conclusion that we're seeing the world as it is. But as we start to think about it, we actually can cross off some of the obvious perceptual conclusions that seem obvious and that we operate on, but that are false. So for example, naive realism is an idea that's commonly understood. It doesn't make it true or not that it's commonly understood, but I'm just informing you that it's commonly understood among philosophers of perception and probably scientists of perception. Right, there's kind of two different fields that a little bit overlap. There's kind of perception in psychobiology, and there's maybe perception in psychology, and then there's perception in philosophy, and they all kind of are different angles or disciplines, but that kind of obviously have some common denominator to them as well. And it's a pretty interesting overall field, at least to me. So anyway, there's broad understanding and agreement. Besides the fact that it's easy to prove, but I'm just letting you know that in this case, there's other things that are easy to prove that no one knows, but in this case, people do know it. People that don't think about perception, don't think about naive realism, and just kind of assume it, except that if you ask them the right questions, they'll say, oh no, of course not, right? And so naive realism is like, yeah, I see the chair as it is, I experience events out as they are, this event is bad, right? Like a kind of philosopher guru about success would also be overlapping with this, and they would talk to you about how bad or success or failure or the appearance of success and failure don't necessarily reside in a particular event or appearance of failure, right? Naive realism is like, I failed, right? I can't pick myself up, I'm done, I failed. Tony Robbins might say, there's no failure, there's only feedback, right? And that's kind of a reframe. And in a sense, it's an angle on overcoming naive realism when it comes to the appearance of failure or a setback, right? Maybe it was like, yeah, like I said, like there's no failure, there's only feedback. He might also say, if you asked him, what about setbacks? Right, there's not really setbacks, there's just feedbacks, right? I haven't heard him say that, but I mean, that's the kind of thing that he probably would say or affirm or whatever, right? It's kind of similar to what he already says. And I'm not, in this case, I'm in agreement with what he's saying. Like it's a totally reasonable perspective, and it's more of like an example of naive realism. Basically, works until it doesn't work, but it works plenty. But it's useful to to be able to step outside of it whenever you want to, especially with your perception of like events and feedback and so forth, right? Or the idea that a person is a jerk if they seem to be a jerk, or even more dangerous often is when someone seems to be honest and so forth, right? If they're not necessarily in certain circumstances, either overall they're overtly conning you, or they're just people are just honest within certain circumstances and dishonest in others, or they're a good worker or a good partner, good teammate in some circumstances and not others. Naive realism would have us kind of just overall say, oh, this person's a great asset or a great partner, or even just that this person in relationships and dating, there's a sense that kind of overlaps with this idea of naive realism, where that can be poisonous in a number of ways, where about attractiveness, like it's an absolute, whereas now there's certainly a relative absolute, which is, I realize it's a bit of a paradox, but it would also be ridiculous to say that there's no sense of beauty whatsoever that's fully in the eye of the beholder, right? And actually, now that I think about it, beauty is kind of a good parallel example or analogy to what I say about how we're interacting with the world, where I say there's obviously an environment and there's obviously a mind, and they have to be interacting, because if you try to remove either one, you get to an absurdity. Same thing with kind of like nature or nurture when it comes to how kids or people turn out, right? If you try to, they say like, oh, there's a debate between nature and nurture, but obviously if you remove either one, you go into nonsense, right? The idea that parents and or the environment have no impact on someone's personality or development or whatever is obvious nonsense. And you can go to the extreme if you want and say, what if you chop somebody's head off, right? When they're 4, then that will probably have an effect on their development, right? And even if you don't full on kill them, if you say, well, that's cheating, David, come on, like anyway, it's obvious that that you just go to more extremes. You realize that obviously the environment or nurture has an impact, but then the idea that genetics doesn't have an impact is also ridiculous. And then that can come up, by the way, when it comes to losing weight, right? And also judging people, right? When it comes to it. This reminds me, I'm being a little bit jumpy here, but there is a real use for the idea of white privilege, right? It's become politicized and used in obviously absurd and hyperbolic, caricatured ways in our world or society right now in America. But the realness to it is judging people, just assuming that that they have all the advantages, right? Maybe they had more, but still, you don't just as a white person want to judge. It's used specifically, particularly in the case of white and black. So I'll just keep it in that context now, right? As a white person, you don't want to judge someone who's black in certain ways that you want to stop and really think about your assumptions before you just say, oh, if I can do it, they can do it, or why don't they just ask their parents for money or just wait for their inheritance, right? Not all white people inherit, but on average, there's a lot more of that, right? So yeah, things like that. There's all sorts of ways that it's used as BS, right? The idea, but there's also can be a real basis for it when it comes to judging people or like, well, if I can do it, why can't they do it, right? There might be times when there's a reality, right, to white privilege in that sense. Obviously, individuals vary massively, right? But there's times when judging overall groups comes up, and judging in that way comes up. Anyway, these are all parallels. So with weight loss, right, like there's once again, you have this kind of mind environment parallel or nature nurture parallel, where saying that genetics don't play a role becomes absurd and causes us to do something similar to the story of Job in the Bible, where it's also why I stress luck. It's one of the many reasons why stressing luck is very important. The idea of denying luck is not good, right? I was using this example when I was talking to Mike about this recently on the phone, Mike Long, and like if you're going to play a game of chance like in Vegas, ignoring the idea of luck and just deciding that if you have the right determination and mindset, that you'll win can be very dangerous, right? It has obvious drawbacks that kind of shows. In a sense, instead of we wouldn't need the whole idea of watching out for white privilege at all if we just had a better understanding of luck intuitively and all over in our world, and we wouldn't judge in various ways that are unfair and that are, you know, annoy people and give them a reason to hit back in worse ways, you know, politically and so forth, lead to a worse backlash. So where were we? Nature, nurture, beauty. With beauty, this is certainly would apply to men, but it applies pretty obviously, reasonably strongly with women, where to say that there's no basis for beauty that's objective becomes absurd really fast. And yet at the same time, obviously, the eye of the beholder is very real and matters too, right? Or else everyone would judge the same person, the same attractiveness, which isn't the case either. But to say that we couldn't guess whatsoever who would seem more attractive on a magazine cover than someone else, or even what version of the same person it's like, oh, I have no idea. It's all in the eye of the beholder. That's equally absurd. So we have the same pattern when it comes to perception and the environment and our mind and so forth. So I was talking about naive realism. Naive realism has a parallel to a lot of things I was talking about. It's naive realism by analogy would be like saying beauty is only objective and not in the eye of the beholder, or that it was only due to genetics or your choice, right? You can almost pick one or the other. But naive realism, the idea that we see things as they are, is utter nonsense, right? There's no there's no color in the external world, so to speak. Like once you get down to, you know, chemistry and physics and so forth, right? They emit photons. We don't see photons. We see, you know, our mind gives us or one way or the other, we get an image that is not the exact same thing as what's in the external world at a number of levels. One of them, you know, again, another obvious example is like the blind spot, right, with the eye, and how we are one way or the other, it gets filled in many cases for us. But it doesn't get filled in with what's necessarily there exactly, right? But more of like a best guess of what's there. And so if our mind eye, whatever, doesn't guess that there's a car there, then that could be a problem if there is a car in our blind spot when we're driving. So if not naive realism, I'll write these words down. Then there's an idea of representational realism. These are very useful concepts to let us, again, think around and eliminate, to try to, and just to give us practice in thinking about the mind and how, and the environment, our consciousness screen, how we relate to it. I find these to be very useful topics to take a look at that and practice looking at it. Because as I said, the early on in this webinar, if we can just make this shift, and a number of you have either made it, right? I'm making this series where I'm mostly talking to people that have delved a lot into what I've been explaining for years, and yet I'm making it where those are the immediate audience, but then I'm also making it for people that are new, hopefully many people who are new over time. So representational realism is the idea, okay, well, what happens is our eye and our mind and so forth create an image of the external world. Well, it can be interesting to realize that that's not the case either. And once that's not the case, then we're really left wondering with kind of a clean slate, which is good in a sense, right? But if I didn't identify these things, then you wouldn't be able to contrast, you wouldn't be able to ask the right questions and contrast these assumptions, right? So normally people go through life and they kind of waffle between representational realism and naive realism, and that's as far as they get. And this also kind of overlaps with something that isn't normally included in perception, maybe, but materialism, which is not referring to like Material Girl by Madonna, like where it's about like buying stuff, but materialism is the scientific or what is it, like scientific naturalism or something like that, methodological naturalism or something, where people assume that the external world and the universe exists in a way that it doesn't. And it's actually a great parallel yet again, because the same type of error occurs when people think that the universe has a certain fundamental existence as the same way that they think that their mind does. Like, so the same error where people think that maybe the universe can make stuff and do stuff is the same type of error as wondering whether our mind can be conscious and therefore experience stuff, have free will, you know, and so forth. So representational realism is the idea that we see an image, as I was saying, of the world, that our mind creates an image and we see an image of the chair. We don't see, like we're seeing the chair, but we're seeing an image of the chair, right? Again, people kind of feel like they're kind of both true, both not quite true, you know, or representational realism is what's really true, and such. I should probably check chat in a little while, but I need to explain what the problem is with representational realism. The problem with representational realism is that it's based on the idea. It's too tied in with materialism. They kind of support each other, but they're supported by nothing, and they're necessarily false. Let's first feel it by seeing it with a computer game. So we're back to where we're sitting in front of a computer playing a game like Minecraft, and we're seeing, let's say, what looks like a field with cows in it, right, and whatever else is trees and whatever. Are you seeing when you look at that, you're seeing a representation of something in some sense, right? But are you seeing a representation of the world? Like, is that an image of the world of Minecraft or of your particular world of Minecraft that got created in your save file? Like, you're not seeing a representation of the code. You're not seeing, right? Like, you're seeing something that is coherent. That coherence is what's really important, right? Like, you can meaningfully interact with it. Like, remember, the coherence goes along with the value of your experience and so forth, right? Coherence is critically important along with the value of your experience. You can interact with it in a way that matters. And that can literally make you feel good, and it kind of should make you feel good in a sense. Like that's the whole reason you're getting involved with it. Like, you're creating a sort of world to delve into and enjoy and play around it, right? It's coherent and meaningful, but it's meaningful in a way that's different from how people normally think. It's like the meaning is real, but created for the sake of the experience, maybe for the sake of lessons that you might learn, right? You might do it with your son and hope to help him develop teamwork or other things, right? But it's not real in other senses. I don't mean in other senses like vision. So it's not real in other meanings of the word real or whatever. It's not foundational. It's not self-existent. It didn't make itself. Your world of Minecraft can't just like go do stuff, right? Like, the Terminator series is based on the idea that that can't be. Like, computers can't just go become conscious and start taking over things. They're not dangerous in that particular way. a nuclear bomb like is very dangerous, but it isn't going to become conscious and start attacking people, right? But it doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Computers or machines could be super dangerous, but not in that way. Not in the idea of them using free will to start killing. Or to get outside of whatever their ultimate programming is, right? Outside their prime directive or whatever. Sorry, I got distracted, but I'll just add this thought in. I realized that a premise of a number of sci-fi robots kill all movies is that their very prime directive is like protect people, and therefore they have to kill everyone in order to protect them, or whatever, because they're destroying the planet or whatever. So, but I'm just not gonna. I acknowledge that, and I'm not gonna get bogged down in it right now. I'll, regardless of whether Skynet could kill everyone, let's put that aside. Whatever it can do, it can't become conscious. Consciousness is not an emergent property of a bunch of programming or information. All right. So I was helping us see and feel this idea of representational realism and materialism and what the issue is by saying that what you see on a computer screen if you're playing a game isn't a representation of the code, in the sense that there's not like a world in there that has fields and cows, and you're not seeing a representation of the cows that are inside the computer somewhere or wherever, you see. So in a fairly similar way, you're not seeing a representation of an external world. In one sense, like suppose that your child was playing with you and they were scared that while you were sleeping, the world would start doing stuff that was real, right? Like that they were having like worries about zombies from a computer game coming out of the screen, or the world that they were playing in that had zombies blending into our world and attacking us. Then you would try to explain to your son that wasn't going to happen. In a weirdly similar way, I'm trying to explain to everyone that the external world, the universe, it can't do anything in a way that's kind of parallel to what I just said. Now, there could be code while you're playing a game like Minecraft where zombies do come and kill your character, right? Like all kinds of stuff, like volcanoes can happen in the real world. I'm not denying that. Okay. But when I say the real world, I'm sorry, the world we take for granted, the physical world, the earth and stuff. I meant what people call the real world. But it doesn't have any power in and of itself. It's contingent. It's like the particular world in a game like Minecraft that you're playing in, the computer game as a whole, your computer, they're all contingent. They all only have the ability to have and no more. And they're very limited. In the case of code, again, it really doesn't do anything. It's just it gets processed by the computer. Without a computer, the code literally would do nothing, right? It wouldn't make zombies or anything like that. So we're seeing a when we experience what we experience, we're seeing a representation of something, just like when you're playing a game, you're seeing a representation of something. But it's not of a world just like what you're experiencing. So if you're in a building with a hallway, and you're sitting in a room in that building, and you look out the door and you see part of the hallway. We have a model of the world where that hallway continues just like how we experience it outside of our experience. And that's not actually the case. The model that we have is totally workable for navigating around the building, but it's not workable if we skip back over to the computer thing. In order to program a computer game, you need to be able to think on the level of a programmer, right? Not on the level of a player of a game. If you're playing a game, then the world just keeps revealing itself as you walk around. But if you imagine if you try to program a game based on that mindset of like, oh, well, okay, this is the part where it just makes itself, right? Or, or whatever. That's nonsense. So when we're trying to think about identity, who we are, and our place in the world, we don't need to, by the way, think about this all the time. We just need to get it right once, and then we build off of it. But our identity is radically different than what people naively and incorrectly think, and that has all kinds of practical, real-world consequences day by day that I can't cover in the same moment that I'm trying to deeply explain this paradigm shift, right? So if I'm deeply explaining the paradigm shift, I'm not talking about the practical consequences very well. And if I'm talking about the practical consequences very well, I'm not helping you with the deep paradigm shift. So in a sense, you have to kind of bear with me or trust me. But this is very useful on every level of day-to-day stuff, midterm projects, success, your relationships, all kinds of stuff. Getting your identity right is unbelievably useful. And we don't have to sit here and philosophize like this in a kind of a confused way nonstop. We're just going to have a breakthrough. We figured out, and we got it, right? But we need to get all the way across, right? So that's why I'm kind of describing and going into this, and I'm going to work at this with you guys. I could spend a few webinars just working on this paradigm shift for you guys, and I'm willing to, and however long it might feel confusing, and it might just feel awesome and fascinating, by the way. But however it feels, you might feel all sorts of different emotions at different times, right? It's just going to be measured in hours where you're going to go through this shift, and then you'll get it at some point in some single digits or tens of hours. And even if it takes a couple hundred hours, it's beyond worth it. But it's not like it's not ongoing throughout your life where you have to sit around philosophizing about your basic identity. You'll just get it at some point, and then as you make the shift, things are kind of simple. Like the world is weirdly profoundly simple to me, and the stuff I'm talking about, it's a little hard to talk about to try to shift people over, or it's very kind of, in one sense, very hard to talk about to shift people over, but it's not hard once you're over. I'm talking about what to me is very simple. It's almost what makes it confusing for me I'm trying to like bridge. So I'm trying to hold in my thinking how things seem to people normally, which is inherently contradictory and makes no sense, except for people feel like it makes sense, right? But it's so nonsensical that it's like a little confusing for me to try to describe it while describing how things are, and trying to think of every possible objection or whatever, or a lot of them, and deal with those at the same time. But again, it's the amount that, to the extent that there's a confusion or a sense of unpleasantness or a sense of not, it would mainly come from a sense of, I don't know if I'm making progress, David, and I want to make progress, right? That's, our mind gives us good feeling based on its assessment of making progress. So if your mind is sometimes not assessing progress while I'm talking about this stuff, that do your best to bear with it. It's going to be, to the extent that you want to trust me, it's beyond worth it and critical. I mean, boy, I can't imagine being locked in the worldview that people are normally locked in. You just can't think about anything coherently. Everything's a jumble of mess, right? And you're trying to think about concepts that, like, again, like love, knowing, like decision making day to day, and your responses to people are based on stuff like decisions are based on knowing and beliefs, right? And so much of your happiness in life is based on where you go with the idea of love, right? And your mind can't think about those concepts properly. It has to squeeze out the consciousness and then think about them in a non-conscious way. Even literally being happy, your mind can't process. It can only so it twists the idea of happiness into that which furthers the goals that are already in it. And it can't really think about what goals you want to have. It can't think outside of itself. And so you're just locked in this world where happiness is constantly slipping through your fingers and very elusive. Peace of mind is, and just making good decisions and reacting to people in a way that's going to be constructive for relationships on a continuous basis, and having a calm confidence, peace of mind. All these things are very nice for relationships. And if you have nice relationships in your life, you're in great shape. Right? And then it makes it fairly easy to make money, especially in combination with other stuff I can teach you. I don't even mean specifics. I just mean I can teach you meta strategies just to understand about money and making it. That just all this stuff snowballs and snowballs. But this right now we're working on getting a certain deep basis for your identity, and that'll allow us to build in a way that is inconceivable otherwise. And so many nice things are possible that you wouldn't realize are possible. I don't mean things that are like magic, but I mean more like, I mean, just the idea of having an effortless, happy marriage. I mean, is assumed to be impossible, in a sense. Every man that I would come across before I got married kind of joked about being afraid of their wife in some way, as if it was a given, and I was determined not to be, in a nice way, but not through bluster or through bullying her, for goodness sakes, but through having just a beautiful relationship, not based on fear. And where fear, by the way, comes from, one of the huge things you can eliminate. I can give a couple of other indications of the benefits of this paradigm shift about identity. 3 concepts are crushing you all over the place. A wrong idea about fairness and related to that justice. That's 2 concepts. And then another one related to liking yourself. Right? I've talked a lot about liking yourself in the past. And you can have your identity. So identity touches upon your idea of self-worth. And your self-worth can actually be based on method. And it all coheres together, right? What we talked about last webinar with method, who you are fundamentally, and identity, like what I'm working on with you now. When your self-worth is based on that you're following a particular methodology to continually root out bad ideas first and foremost in your own mind, then you can enjoy appreciation and good sentiments from other people. I greatly enjoy your nice feedback and your participation and all the nice sentiments I get from you guys. But without depending on it in a way that is a problem and that can cause you to be so easily manipulated, that can poison your relationships nonstop, make it so difficult to have a good love relationship, to where you have to define down a good love relationship, utterly, and to even think you can have anything close to it. And you'll just, for example, as a guy, and there's a parallels for women, but as a guy, you'll like spend all your money, trying to be validated. You'll just run out of it all. It's the weirdest thing. Mike Long just knows, of course, so many people in the overall niche of internet marketing, people that are good with all kinds of things with internet marketing, and it's such a lucrative thing, and people make all sorts of money, they do successful stuff, but like no one has money almost besides myself, and there could be some other or people that are kind of in my orbit. I can't take credit, I don't see it like necessarily for Greg keeping his money. I think he has, so just because he's close, I don't want to imply that he doesn't, but it's, when I say no, let me just say, like, a shockingly small number, but vanishingly small, actually have money, right? And it's just, but it kind of illustrates it's so hard to hold on to money when you're trying to prove that you're awesome without realizing it, right? But everyone is, and they're just trying to buy it, right? By having more employees, by reinvesting in their business, so to speak. But they're really just trying to, people call it all sorts of stuff, but what are you investing in when you're trying to make your business bigger than it needs to be, right? Like, there could be a valid reason for having a larger business, right? If someone actually ends up where it's a good plan, but so many times, so there's plenty of valid reasons for investing in your business. But so many times when people do it, They're just investing in trying to prove that they're awesome in some way by being, bigger and having more employees and having more overall sales and just bigger, right? And that's how so many businesses fail too. There's times to reinvest in a business for sure, but it's hard to clearly see those times when your vision is obfuscated and occluded with trying to validate yourself. And it's such a poison that's unavoidable unless you get identity right. So it's basically going to cost you all your money to not make that shift, that one shift. And that wouldn't be apparent necessarily to your mind when I'm talking about this stuff about representational realism, materialism, and trying to get your identity right. But that one thing can be everything or nothing in terms of money and relationships. And then there's a lot more than that. But that one benefit is just kind of unlimited in how much it can screw you or how much it can help you. Getting your sense of validation right. Your sense of how to make progress towards liking yourself. Maybe we could say, instead of saying don't have a goal to like yourself, we could say, well, of course you have a goal to like yourself and you care about yourself, but your goal for what constitutes progress towards yourself, your growth, your whatever the heck. Growth itself is an assumption, right? But whatever involves progress for you yourself becoming better. And why do we want ourselves to become better? There's a valid reason. It's implicit in our experience, which is that things aren't perfect yet. So obviously we want them to be better. That's logically true. It has to be. So there's no way to escape wanting yourself in some sense to be better, right? So, and I'm explaining this in a bit of a new way now as I'm developing. So it has to be that on some level you want things to be better, and part of those things that, like the thing that's most tied to things being better is going to be yourself, whatever that is, right? And so, or whatever you identify with, that's the closest, right? The thing that has the most impact on how things being as good or perfect as they can be for yourself. So you want betterness for yourself, and either that's going to come from so that means there's going to be a sense of progress that your mind wants to make. If that progress can be rooted in method, seeking understanding, getting more good ideas and less, and dissolving bad ideas, that if you have that, you're in unbelievably good shape. If you don't have that, that void is going to be filled with progressing in ways that amount to validation, to kind of false validation. And that's going to involve some combination of other people basically flattering you and giving you approval, and or you building some bigger edifice, like business or something like that, right? Or career status, right? Type of thing. So it's going to come out in one of those ways in most cases, and it's typically going to cost you a lot of your money and relationships and stuff, and or make you very easy to manipulate. There's probably some kind of other places it can come out where it won't cost you all your money, but it'll basically cost you some other thing, Okay. I know I can talk more about this, and I will, but let's talk for a little bit together. And also, I said address some other questions. When it comes to this shift of consciousness, perception, and so forth, it's really just a matter of being willing. It's to the extent to which I'm within the limits that I have then it's going to come down to talking more about it in a way that is sometimes has breakthroughs and sometimes is on the way to a breakthrough where it can feel kind of like we're flopping around and talking around it. The way you have a breakthrough is you just kind of fill in context, in a sense, at random, right? I mean, if you knew exactly how to fill in context around a concept or a breakthrough, then you kind of would already have had the breakthrough in a certain sense, right? So you're just kind of talking or accumulating or doing stuff. It's not, or thinking, talking, doing, whatever, that is somewhat related or as closely related as you can think of to the topic that you're trying to have a breakthrough with. And then at some point you have the breakthrough. Like that's basically how it works. So that's why me just kind of talking about the topic with things that are related to it is just more toward getting people to a breakthrough. And since I can't, the breakthrough has to happen for various people in various ways at various times. I can't know when that exactly happens. So it's going to amount to me just kind of talking about stuff related to this in a sense. Joseph says, you keep blowing my mind. This is so cool. Great. And I'll scroll up in a second. Fletch says, at some point, could you extrapolate more from a perspective of learning on dissolving bad ideas like unlearning? Oh, I'll tell you one thing, because the very fact you're asking this question, there's two things that go on. One is realizing, getting knowledge that an idea is bad by spotting a contradiction. And there's a second thing that has to do with the feeling, which is based essentially on like neuroassociations, changing. That could be something like gaining clarity that God exists. And then you go, without realizing it or kind of by habit, you go to check whether you feel now like God exists. And you might say, well, the feeling didn't change. Well, feelings change over time based on just like physical stuff changing. But when you realize something, you can both let go of you might remember me talking about when you just let go of a certain type of feeling of should, like something should be true. That's like the first step. Either it should be true if it's not, or it should be false if it's true. Let me give an example here. Okay, so sticking with the example of God being real. If someone doesn't have the feeling like God is real and they get clarity on why God has to be real, but then they feel like, well, something's wrong because I don't feel it yet, then they can at least let go of the idea that God shouldn't, like it should, like they shouldn't feel that God exists. Or like imagine an atheist that also kind of implicitly or somewhat subconsciously feels like God shouldn't exist. Same thing with, suppose somebody judges homosexuals, feels like there's something in some way immoral about being homosexual. Well, that there's a reason why that happens, because there's a mistake that people make where a feeling of disgust, and I in no way am implying that someone should feel disgust, it's just that in practice there's certain things that for some people feel disgusting, right? Usually has to do with biological functions, right? Things that that don't further like cleanliness, procreation, like health, things like that, right? So for some people, homosexuality can feel disgusting, right? And there's all sorts of other things that can feel disgusting to people. And then therefore, then the mind confuses that with morality. Disgust and morality, again, it's an error that some psychologists are aware of, or whatever, some philosophers of morality are aware of. That obviously they're not related inherently, right? They're not logically related. Something can look disgusting, but be healthy, right? Like a food can, the same way. In parallel, things that are that look disgusting can feel like they're unhealthy, right? But of course, the food could seem disgusting, but actually be healthy theoretically. Where was I going with this? Sorry, I weirdly lost my train of thought. On dissolving bad ideas, right? So suppose someone thought through things correctly and realize that it's absurd to attach any negative morality whatsoever to homosexuality. They still might feel, so what they could start by doing is stop thinking that they should, it should be felt to be immoral, right? So you let go of the should, and that starts the process going, and then over time, other associations or feelings can catch up. There's so many things that I want to talk about, in different ways. So let's see here. It just made me think of something. I'll say it when I think of it. In the discussion, so to speak, the public social discussion about transgender people, there's the thing brought up about well, do we want people dressing up, as women that are men and going in and to where your daughter's using the bathroom, right? And that's mentioned. But if once we get in the habit of checking ideas in a certain way, there's kind of something I want to get to at some point, everything I want to get to fairly soon, but where you do just certain habits of checking ideas. The thing is, if you just check that idea, like it seems like it makes so much sense on the surface, right? Like, oh yeah, we don't want that. Ultimately, what we want is, just to be able to first think about these things just accurately and not have them not be able to think about them, in a good way. But for that one thing, men already, regardless of any transgender opinions and or laws or social things, a man can just already dress like a woman if they want and go into a woman's bathroom. Right? Like any attitudes or laws and or policies about transgender doesn't have any impact on the fact that a man, if they wanted to, could just disguise themselves as a woman and go into the woman's bathroom, right? So it's actually, that point is irrelevant for transgender issues. Now, regarding biological men competing in women's sports, again, once people are just looking at it objectively, then that we wouldn't want that, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Well, we would definitely want to bend with any people. We want to bend over backwards to, especially with any kind of group or psychologically, racial, or whatever, that is experiencing difficulties, like where it's not easy for them, like with people where they have a physical handicap, right? We want to bend over backwards within reason, right? Like our inclination is certainly, well, yeah, anything that the tie goes to, we certainly would want to accommodate people that have physical handicaps, right? Certain regulations and laws can go overboard and not help, right? Then we don't want those. But certainly, all things being equal, we'd love to accommodate like physically handicapped people, right? I'm not making an analogy. I'm just that one point to people that are transgender type people. I'm not in any way calling them handicapped. I'm just making it the parallel, just the narrow point that I was making. But so we want to bend over backwards whenever possible to accommodate people that have that situation, just like with any situation. But of course, one place that's basically counterproductive would be women's sports. It's not a big issue for me. I'm only using this as just an example of how clear thinking can just clear up, just various things, or just, it doesn't even answer the question. But what's my method is we just pare back, PARE, back confusion. And then as we pare back confusion, the right answers emerge. I don't even know the right answers on, obviously tons of things, but, on various nuances with, it's a difficult question. There's difficult questions with how to best make life as comfortable as possible for transgender people, while making life as comfortable as possible within that framework for other people, and so. But as we eliminate, unhelpful or wrong parts of things, framework that accumulates, then over time we see better what is, helpful. All right, so what are we talking about? So the first step, this is going to come up in a practical matter a lot, is when you come across a bad idea, that what you want to do is really value a certain initial step, which is, by the way, a pattern that occurs a lot too, is valuing a very basic first step, right? That I've talked about that in practical areas like getting started in a business project. It also is very relevant just with the idea of knowledge itself, where just very basic understandings about knowledge, like starting to differentiate out seems versus is in your consciousness screen, even before you have any idea how you could use that. So I would say that when it comes to extrapolating on dissolving bad ideas and unlearning, value that initial step of a sense of not even a sense, but like gaining clarity on why the idea has a contradiction. So that what that'll do is start, bad ideas tend to be held in place by a sense that they should feel it. A great example, and another great example of how people feel like they should feel some way that keeps a bad idea in place is when it comes to healing from abuse. People feel like they need to feel pain in order, and it's all tied in with justice, fairness, guilt. In this case, not necessarily fairness, but with justice, like, and I've talked about this with raising kids, is where you don't want to teach them to not hurt other people. You want to teach them to respect property rights of other people. Because the hurt, there's several drawbacks to the hurt thing, the idea of not hurting, but one of them is that people need to hold on to their hurt. They think they do, or else what the abuser did isn't wrong, right? Like it feels like I need to not heal, because if I heal, then, well, I guess by the assumption that someone needs to hurt someone else in order for something to be wrong, well, then now the abuser is no longer wrong. Isn't that fascinating? So they have to hold on to their hurt. So they feel like they should hold on to it. Once, if I point all that out and they get it, once they realize it's no longer the case that they should hold on to their hurt, that dissolves this kind of attractor or invisible magnet that's ultimately holding things in place. And then that's going to allow you can set up things in the environment that help pull things away from the other direction towards healing. But then even outside of that, you'll naturally heal, and then you can accelerate the healing. Or with any feeling of something, when it comes to believing or knowing that God exists, then you can talk to God, even if you gain some clarity that God exists, or even that God might exist when you previously thought that God definitely didn't exist. Then you can talk to God and it doesn't hurt anyone, right? Another thought I had just randomly about law of implication is one of the cool things that people that are maybe new can realize about the stuff I'm talking about is it's quite safe. Like all the conclusions that we're coming to, like the morality of personal property rights, right? It neither excludes self-defense, which can be dangerous in certain ways and doesn't really make sense in certain areas. But then outside of that, it doesn't encourage violence towards anyone, right? It doesn't involve oppression towards anyone. Even pretty wonderful and benign religions or philosophies, nothing in what Jesus said, but in an overall beliefs of a number of Christians based on things Paul wrote, which is one of the reasons why I think people need to have a different perspective on Paul being infallible, is Paul really explicitly says that homosexuals are bad and in essence should be persecuted. Paul wouldn't affirm that you should like physically persecute them, but at the point where you're saying this is immoral, then persecution naturally has to follow in some way, shape, or form, even if it's not physical, even if it's just people looking down on you or whatever, right? So, but with law of implication, there's not really drawbacks to the conclusion. There's no like hidden kind of weird thing. There's things that are weird to people, like saying that Paul isn't God can be weird to nearly every Christian or seem heretical or whatever. But or they might say, well, of course Paul isn't God, but Paul was infallible, and we can study what Paul wrote, and it's perfectly infallible. It's the word of God, so Paul might as well be God in every way except for actually being God. When I say that's not the case, then that can feel very threatening or weird perhaps to some people, but it's not dangerous. There's nothing bad that can come out of not worshiping Paul as God or in effect worshiping Paul as God. As a matter of fact, there's a few things Paul said that can have negative effects, whereas with Jesus there aren't, if you look. Okay, so I think that addressed Fletcher's question and a little bit more. is listening to this before the breakthrough like being the corn cooking before it pops, or do we actively influence it? Is the active part keeping it in front of the mind? Yeah, active would only help for sure. Any participation, any extra thinking you do, any time you take to yourself, working on these topics, you can write down a question and then look at the keywords in that question and circle them, and then try to think about what they mean, and maybe make scenarios, trying to construct the meaning of various questions. Like, how do I have a wonderful love relationship, or what would a wonderful love relationship look like? And then you can circle love, relationship, look, you know, so forth. Megan is affirming something I think very nice. And I better scroll up also to my questions I put in, and we've already gone over 2 hours. So I already expected that we're gonna have to continue kind of this overall thing with these four, remember these four kind of paradigm shifts. I'm just gonna keep on going and help us through these paradigm shifts. And also, as I said, a kind of cool idea is that a person who's new, or old, so to speak, but a person who's new can just pick one of these things that really is interesting to them and tug on it, and it'll lead to all the rest. Goals and success, identity that we talked about today, power, knowledge. Okay. Megan says, David is talking about how essential and practical it is to get identity correct. 2 tremendous breakthroughs for me about identity early on listening to David were: 1, I'm not my mind or my body. I'm an aware being with a consciousness field, excellent, which I also call consciousness screen these days. And 2, when I stopped worrying about what other people thought of me and trying to meet endless standards and norms. Oh yeah, I haven't even mentioned the term standards and norms yet, which is a big concept. It's a big part of how people determine what's true is what's normal. You know, need to get into that as well. Endless standards and norms, and rather based on my identity, on method by thinking of a simple metaphor. I'm an aware being who understands what's important, or at least who's seeking to understand what's important. Oh, but you do understand, right? If you have even the one fundamental idea about seeking understanding, then you do understand what's important in the sense of the strongest basis, especially when you combine that with understanding God exists, that we want everyone to have the best net value of experience, everyone in existence too. Ultimately, we want to dissolve bad ideas, right? And again, none of these things, and my focus on the individual or the reality of it, but that is part of law of implication, or what I say, where the individual. I had a slide on this. Let me see here. Did I? Here, identity. Oh, it's right on the identity slide that I had up. The individual, not we, as the basic unit of knowing, ownership, moral responsibility, value, power, decision making, etc. This is super important. It shows, as you guys know and I've made clear, I vastly prefer conservatives versus American liberals. However, conservatism, I've mentioned that it's a nonsense ideology to the extent that it's based on the Constitution. The very first few words in the Constitution set an inherently contradictory frame that has caused many problems and suffering relative to what could be. Now, the Constitution as a practical matter relative to other governments and situations has been wonderful, relatively speaking. But starting out with a horrible contradiction has led to a lot of problems and suffering. And America, in addition to, relatively speaking, doing all sorts of wonderful things and having a lot of wonderful aspects to it, has had some horrible things like the Civil War. And the way things are now is just horrific, with a culture war and being at each other's throats. And I don't think the problem is that we're at each other's throats. I think the problem is a very, very, what's a good word, vile and dangerous ideology on the part of one of the major ideological groups, the political groups in America, and then another ideology that is flawed in many ways, bad in many ways, far preferable. But the problem isn't that they're fighting. The problem is more like the worst of the problems is a vile ideology. And then there's a whole bunch of problems in addition to that. So one of the things that creates both the problems inherent within, if conservatives won the day fully, there'd still be lots of problems because of flaws in the ideology. And then it also makes it conservatism very weak at fighting against a far more vile ideology that has to try to combat in a practical sense. And literally the Constitution starts with "we the people," which is horrific in its implications. And in a very practical way, boy, does it horrible. And boy, did it result in so much horrible evil towards Japanese people, both in America when they're put in concentration camps. It's not a part of American history that's talked about much, but America basically behaved on a somewhat smaller, on a noticeably smaller scale than the Nazis, but pretty identical actions. They had concentration camps for Japanese people, where they were literally stripped of their belongings, as far as I understand it, their lives. Sorry, they weren't stripped of their lives, but they're stripped of what we think of as our life, except for our being killed. But basically, everything was taken from them. They were put in concentration camps, American, Japanese, and then there was an actual Holocaust twice, right, towards the Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, based on the idea of this "we," right? The Japanese are a "we" that is morally responsible, right? For as if the babies in their mother's arms in Nagasaki were responsible and part of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent war, and so let's burn them alive, right? That was actually done twice. And that's just one of bazillions of examples of this terrible "we." The Civil War, right, which was just involved an unbelievable amount of property violation and suffering. Another of many examples on a small and large scale of "we," and basically the hundreds of millions of people have been just flat out killed with ideologies like there's just all sorts of nuances and slightly different forms of this "we" ideology, but with communism and so forth, the idea you just act as if a group of people can be morally responsible, can have power, right? Every time I wince whenever I see people, the government, they work for us, they need to do this. I'm like, how naive. That's logically impossible that they could work for us, because there's no us that they can work for. There's only individuals. And also it's radically naive too. Nothing about the American government officials is that they work for us in any way, shape, or form. We don't pay them. Money is taken, and it's no longer taxpayer money. It's now the property. It's ill-gotten property, but I don't mean it's morally the property. I just mean that it's functionally the property of the people that took it. It's no longer taxpayer money that's being paid to government officials and government workers to do stuff. That's just logic. So this, but to contrast, by having the individual be the basic unit, by just doing that in the world, by just seeing individuals as the only entity that can make decisions, have power, the people in Iran can't rise up against the Ayatollahs. Right? An individual person can do or can't do this, that, or the other thing. Right? We don't pick the president. Right? You can vote, and that does what it does. Right? Which is extremely little, and it certainly isn't deciding who's president. You don't get to decide who's president, which means you do not decide who's president, which means you do not pick the person who's president. So we don't pick the person who's president, and you, because there's no such thing, and you don't obviously pick the person who's president, unless you're, whoever, perhaps. So it's so safe by having this philosophy and understanding. It's not an opinion, right? It's not a perspective. It's a truth that an individual is the unit of all these things. Then all the problems and oppression and various philosophies and ideologies, it all has to, in addition to whatever other errors it makes the error of the "we," error, and then it goes on from there. And of course, it's always these people need to have their property violated, and these special people have more. It's always just some form of that. It's all just, even conservatism has that, right? But it's just on a lesser scale by far. So it's more benign of a cancer, so to speak. All right. I didn't even read Megan's whole thing here. Based on my, so I stopped worrying about what other people thought of me and trying to meet endless standards and norms, and rather based my identity on method by thinking of a simple metaphor. I'm an aware being. This is great for people who understands what's important and solves problems with a process that works, like how I do jigsaw puzzles, and that this metaphorical jigsaw puzzle process can be applied to almost any situation. Awesome. Instead of thinking, am I measuring up to some nebulous standard or expectation, I saw myself as I'm the jigsaw puzzle solver. Although simplistic, these two things gave me a great start on making the important paradigm shift to clear out the confusion and start winning. Absolutely. I kind of got bogged down, but I'm kind of accidentally on purpose or out of a certain type of necessity. I got, again, bogged down has a certain connotation that's unfortunate, but whatever. I got involved today with helping with you to, I'm about to say the word prove. The very idea of prove, I should talk about more in a future or next webinar, because people have an idea like a proof is either making a case or it's a set of axioms or syllogisms or whatever, when in fact, it's more like a breakthrough of a critical mass of understanding where you get clarity on something. And so I wanted to help people get clarity to whoever might struggle. And a lot of people that might not struggle, they maybe should struggle, and instead they just feel a certain truth, and so they skip over it. That works when it happens to be true anyway. I mean, you can take my word for a number of things and be really well off, right? But ultimately, I want to get us all, including myself, which I could be much better at explaining and helping with this, right? Because we need to spread this, right? So we need to kind of we need to spread it, but we also have to spread it for ourselves. So what I see from questions is people are working on things by themselves and they run into stumbling blocks or issues. And so sometimes I try to do a bit of a stream of consciousness webinar like this one in particular, whereas last couple webinars are a little bit more structured. And it'll just sort of happen different ways at different times with my webinars. One thing I won't do though is, I won't check out. We'll keep going right until we get it, as always. But I like to do these things with you in a certain way sometimes, right? To, again, keep giving different angles on things to help get the breakthrough. So it was sort of accidentally on purpose in a sense. You never thought about the Constitution that way, right? Fascinating, right? That we the people is utterly poisonous, and it starts things off on exactly the opposite note, and it's the same note that the most evil ideologies are based on. We the people. Nope, we individuals. Now, in practice, America has had one of the strongest focuses, both as a culture, as the various like the Protestant, the strains of Protestantism that were strongly shaped American culture to begin with, just happen to be, relatively speaking, very benign and preferable, right? And the strains of Protestantism that came about, to some degree, this is opinion, but I'm not really biased that I know of, and so it's just kind of interesting to think about. Let's see, avocados discussion. That's funny. I was talking about this disgust and morality being confused by the mind. That's awesome. All right, let me go to what I originally posted and just address those briefly here. So let me see what I can do, and then I'll have to end things because we're, as usual. My wife pointed out to me in one webinar, maybe the first part of the second one. I started out saying I need to bring this to a close like an hour and a half before I did. It's pretty funny. All right. I said I would answer this one, right, from Roberto here. This is one on top, and then there's another one that someone wrote to me. Let me skip down here. Let me see which one I can do. Hi, David. This is in a private chat, so I just lifted it rather than showing the person's name. There's nothing embarrassing about it, but I still, when someone sends me a private chat, I don't lift the whole thing and their name. And I also read it to make sure I'm not lifting something that would be obviously embarrassing in addition. After watching your last webinars and following your work for a number of years now, keep having this come up and wondering if you're able to address it. Forgive me if I don't express this clear enough, but as silly as it might sound, how do we rule out something non-conscious as the cause and reasons why we experience what we experience? Because I keep arriving at an infinite egress. what's the cause reason for God? Okay, yeah, so this question is related to what I dwelled on in this webinar, and the type of thinking about it is related. Um, I can give a little bit more of an indication of the answer, and as I continue on in the next few webinars, it'll kind of lend more light to this overall issue, because it's something like this comes up in various ways and manifestations for people, as it should. It's when I say it should, as people try to transition and deal with default thinking and the default worldview and the default epistemology and make the shift over, there's various questions or confusions that will come up as a matter of pretty normal course. And something like this, whether or not it's this exact question, is the kind of thing. The original epistemology that we have, that we're born with, is we tend to think that like pre-scientific people have all these superstitions, right? Like the gods are angry and then they make it thunder, and or they withhold rain for the stuff. But that obfuscates a funny fact, which is that babies basically use the scientific method, the basic scientific method of, you observe, you develop a hypothesis based on your observations, and then you test it through experience, through interacting with the world, right? And then if you corroborate it, that's one thing. I've gone over this in the last couple of webinars briefly. So the scientific method, codifying it and using it, people certainly ignore it in plenty of ways, and it certainly was useful to kind of codify it in a certain way and use it rigorously in various situations, right? There's times when double-blind trials and so forth are useful, and there's times when not exactly doing that, but being careful with data and so forth are good. But it's an inverted, kind of backwards in a certain sense, way of exploring the world. It starts by assuming that you are your body and mind. There is an outside world, right? It kind of starts with that kind of blurred combination of naive realism and representational realism. And then you're trying to learn about the world. And it's like the world seems to be what's making stuff and doing stuff. And it's like physical laws are ruling things, and gravity does this and gravity does that. And so the idea of causes and reasons also seems to reside in the outside world, and maybe also in our mind, right? We could say, is my mind doing this? Is this in my mind only, or is it real, right? We might say that implies that my mind can cause something like a psychosomatic disease or an effect in our body, but also, or is it coming from the outside world, the external world? Is it real? We need to develop a different worldview, because whenever we come from that worldview, then so whenever we still have one foot in that worldview, I'm interrupting myself here, because remember, as I say, you can get into a movie or get into a computer game, or you can talk about a computer game with someone or for yourself as if it's real, and that's good and useful as long within the right context, right? So you can have both feet in the idea that the physical world is real and you're really your body and mind interacting with it, and that's perfectly fine as long as you can get both feet out of it when you need to for what you're thinking about. So when I say having one foot in and one foot out, you want to be able to jump out with both feet when necessary. When we go through the understanding or proof that God exists, then we're starting with the idea that we have our consciousness field and how it is the way that it is. It could be some other way. So because of that, because of its existence, and then especially because of its coherence and the fact that it is one way rather than all the other ways that it could be, something has to be able to make it in the first place. And there has to be some reason why it is a way, the way that it is, and not some other way. So why can't there be an infinite regress is I'm not I'm not trying, there's no God of the gaps here. It's not like, oh, I don't know what's making my consciousness field, therefore it's God. That's what how evolutionists or atheists characterize somewhat fairly, somewhat unfairly, creationism or various versions of creationism. I'm not hypothesizing God. I'm not making God as an explanation. I'm building a concept, which then another concept, it reveals another concept. So I'm not positing that I have a consciousness field, right? I experience that I do. That there has to be some basis for my knowledge, and that's that. And then I build on that with things like there's a coherence to the consciousness field, or if you have any trouble with that there's a coherence, like I said, you can just say, well, there's no point in thinking anyway if there isn't a coherence. Once in a while, you can just fall back on that if you're confused and come back to it if you want. So there has to be something capable of making the consciousness screen or field. I should say consciousness screen these days. The consciousness screen. There has to be something capable of making it since it's there. I experience it. It exists. It doesn't have to exist in the somewhere. It exists because I'm aware. Like I'm aware of it. I know that what I'm aware of exists, or I wouldn't be aware of it. So, at all, I'd be aware of nothing. So there has to be something capable of making consciousness screens. And then I'm going to put a word to that. But when I put a word God to that, what's easy to do is to import other parts of the definition or meaning of God outside of what I just created, constructed. And that's one of the things we have to learn not to do. So God, at that point in my reasoning, has only one quality, or it's a word that's attached to a concept that emerged, the concept of something that's capable of making consciousness fields. You could then, but then someone could say, well, wait a second, David. If God exists, if this thing exists that can make consciousness fields, then that means there has to exist something that can make that thing, since it exists. But that is wrong. One way that you can tell that it's wrong is the infinite regress, by the way. That's an indication that something's inherently absurd. But see, God can't be anything different than what God is. And I remember not to import meanings of God. What I mean is there's a concept, something able to make consciousness screens. That concept can't be anything different than what it is. It's a concept that emerged, right? Like if I add 2 and 3, and I hadn't previously had the concept of 5, I'm just starting out in my mathematical discoveries. If I add 2 and 3, I now build the concept 5. That concept doesn't need to be created by an infinite regress or a creator. That concept can only be what it is, 5. Nothing necessarily had to create 5. Now 5 is different than God, and then 5 can't make other stuff, right? But still, I came up with a concept of God in a way that is relevantly similar to the concept of coming up with 5 by adding 2 plus 3. The consciousness screen could be other than it is. It could not exist at all, right? If the consciousness screen could possibly not exist, which it could possibly not exist, and I'll get to the objection if someone wants to chime in, but maybe it can't possibly not exist. Sure, it well, it exists. I'm not making it, right? Of course, it could not exist because the burden of proof is the other way. One of the things to look out for is the invisible shifting of the burden of proof. You'd have to prove that something couldn't exist for it couldn't not exist, like it has to exist. But we can prove that God has to exist. Since it's totally plausible that your consciousness screen wouldn't exist, just the same way that you could not exist. That's possible. Not anymore, right? But anyway, you can think through what I said and work on it, but it'll turn out to be correct. And the proof is correct. Like that the burden of proof is something doesn't start out self-existent or unable to not exist. It starts out with the possibility of not existing, and there has to be some proof otherwise. So your conscious screen doesn't have to exist, but it does. So there you are, you're thinking about it for the first time, you're aware of it. And then, all right, well, it doesn't have to exist, but it does. And so something, and there it is. And it doesn't have to keep changing, but it does, right? If it was perfectly static with no meaning or anything, then first of all, you couldn't think in the first place. But second of all, some of these objections would at least be a little confusing, right? Or at least pause. But since your conscious screen keeps changing and in a coherent manner, then of course something keeps making it, right? Like duh. And then there has to be something. You need to be able to. I'm just about to end the webinar, but you have to be able to distinguish between something to think about this. And that's the following. It's possible, of course, for your conscious screen to not exist, but now that it exists, now that your conscious, I know I keep saying, yeah, anyway, conscious screen, right? It's possible for your conscious screen to not exist. However, once it does exist, it no longer is possible for your conscious screen to not like have existed. Like maybe it could wink out of existence in the future, but right now, while you're experiencing it, it can't not exist while you're experiencing it. Okay, so it could have not existed in one sense, which is correct. So you have to think about why it exists and why it keeps changing. But now that it exists right this moment, you start there. So it has to exist because it does right now. Given that, its creator has to exist. It's necessary, and it can't not exist. And it's something that has to exist, and it doesn't have to be created because it's not. Bertrand Russell, who's supposed to be this great philosopher, made this basic mistake. The basic mistake was, if everything has a cause, he wrote this. He said, if everything has a cause, then God must have a cause. So who caused God? Super God, and who caused that? Super duper God, or whatever, right? I might be blending together Daniel Dennett's commentary on what Bertrand Russell said, but Bertrand Russell said at the beginning of it, and Daniel Dennett, who's an evolutionist who ridiculed theists and so forth, from Tufts University, he wrote Darwin's Dangerous Idea, I think, and other things. Anyway, he was, so anyhow, but that's wrong, because the premise is not a premise that I'm using or that should be used. It's not true that everything has a cause, but it's true that things that could be otherwise, that are inherently contingent, those have to have a cause. So your conscious screen has to have a cause. And if it changes, that has to have a cause and a reason, and the thing causing it has to have a reason why it changes. If it's contingent, if it could be otherwise. But God, a thing, a whatever, that's able to make consciousness fields, has to be there, can't be any different, it's not contingent. And then we could discover, well, why does God have to be conscious? Well, because it's one of the things that has to be in order to make a consciousness field. Just think it through. Just look at the opposite. Suppose there's something that's not conscious. How's it supposed to make a consciousness field? You have to be able to envision a consciousness field first. So someone could say, well, have you ever made a consciousness field? How do you know? We'll just keep thinking it through, like I put on the slide about the 4 parts of the method. Just keep clarifying and simplifying, and it'll be clear. I can delve into all these things over time, more and more, but I'll have to end the webinar now. Looks like I will have to address Robbie's question, Roberto's question. Okay, Robbie, I think uses both names in different places. But let me just look at it. Regarding your comment about mismatching the Mona Lisa and dogs playing poker, are you saying that they are different or seem different? Oh, I can answer this pretty quickly. They seem, I'm saying that what matters, that the only thing that really matters is they seem different. So if you're looking at pictures of 2 paintings, could be on a computer screen or whatever, but you're looking at them side by side. It doesn't matter if you're in a virtual reality machine without you knowing it, and you're not really looking at a computer screen. The virtual reality is making you think you're looking at a computer screen. Like there's a virtual reality of a computer that's not real, it's coded for. It's real in the sense that it's coded in the virtual reality program. But you're looking at a virtual reality program created computer with a screen that's of course created also by the virtual reality. On that screen are pictures or seeming to be on the screen. When I say on the screen are pictures of 2 paintings, obviously there's no real screen in one sense because the virtual reality is creating it in my scenario, right? But there still seems to be a screen, and there is in some sense a screen, right? And you can take this through on your own time some more if you want, but there seems to be two different pictures. You can tell for sure that they're different, but I'm not obviously saying that you can tell for sure that they're real in some physical sense, because in my scenario itself, there's a virtual reality that you don't even realize creating this whole experience. So I'm not saying there really is a computer screen, because I'm actually saying there isn't, except for what the virtual reality is making. But they seem different, but there's something somewhere between the code, the interface, and so forth that's different about those two pictures, or else they couldn't even seem different. So I am saying that. So there's a difference somewhere that's real in some sense. Somewhere within the cause of those two pictures, whatever's causing those two pictures, and the complex set of the complex or not so complex set of things that are going on. And I understand a lot more than I'm saying, but I can only say, and I've talked about it. Some of you know more context about code and interface and so forth, and how reality works, as I've described for how it really works. None of which is a theory or a weird opinion. It just actually makes sense out of the conundrums that naive realism you run into with naive realism, representation of realism, and so forth. There's another thing called perceptualism, which is neither representational realism nor naive realism, but it's the idea that our mind is creating it all. That's not the case either, right? We need to take into account something to do with the external environment, something to do with your mind or interface, but somewhere there's a difference. And you don't even need to worry about what's going on in the external world, because you can get really far if we just got our thoughts straight, like internally with our scenarios and what we can think of as stipulations and conditionals. If you just got everything, like if with government, for example, we just figured out if this happens, then this should be the policy, or there shouldn't be a government or whatever. Then if we just got it straight in our head, so to speak, then that would be beneficial for making it happen better, right, in the external world. Even if we make mistakes in judging the external world, it's still much better to have, like, do you want to have an accurate map or an inaccurate map if you're traveling somewhere? Obviously, an accurate map is way better, right? That doesn't mean you won't get lost even with an accurate map, because you just might get confused when you're looking around, and you might think that this is the second light when it's actually the third light. You didn't notice one of the lights. But it'd be much better to have an accurate map or directions, right? If your directions, if you're supposed to turn right at the second light, it's kind of profound as I end up the webinar here. If you're supposed to turn, this really helps for you to understand the usefulness of accurate thinking just in your own head without worrying about the external world for a moment, is this mental image, this illustration. It's clearly better to have written instructions. I understand we have GPS these days, but put that aside. Written instructions that say turn right at the second traffic light, if that's correct, right? That doesn't mean you won't accidentally count the traffic lights wrong or whatever, right? But if on the whole, you had a website telling people how to get to your place of business and you had it accurate, that would be way better than having it inaccurate, despite the fact that some people might make mistakes following the directions, right? Same thing in life or in business plans or in all kinds of things. Even raising your kids or how to react with your kids. It's way better to have a good model of how to interact with your kids that just, that gets basic things right. Even if you sometimes screw it up, you'd rather have the right ideas in your mind, right? So that's also part of the answer to Roberto's question, great question from last webinar, is separate from getting bogged down about how things match the external world. For now, for the sake of understanding the thinking clearly method, let's get straight how to play with ideas just in our mind without and learning how to separate them from how they correspond to some external world. That's again, the first thing we want to do is think just separate from the external world, and then add in stuff in the external world instead of trying to jumble them together to start with in our thinking, because then we're kind of hopelessly confused from the start without ability to undo. So super, actually address both these questions. I'll force myself to end the webinar now, and we will keep going. Sometimes in the future, for anyone new, things will be structured and coherent and immediately satisfying. Other times I might think that they're not satisfying, but you will feel very satisfied. Other times I'll think that you're very satisfied and you're not. But we're doing our best, and we have some really great, very practical benefit stuff to all of this. Sometimes something will seem very useful and practical, and you won't end up applying it. Other times it might not, seem practical, but it'll end up being everything for you over time. So the bottom line is, hopefully you like me and/or trust me enough that you'll keep going, and/or you don't like me or trust me, but you feel like these concepts have so much potential, you'll stick with me anyway. Whatever works to just keep going, we'll keep going, and get it right over time. Take care, guys. Love you all. You guys are really been wonderful. I know I have to end up skipping past a lot of chat, but it really does mean a lot to me that it's there, and it means a lot to other people. And so thank you for participating, even if I didn't happen to go over anything specific from particular chats. I love that I encourage you to keep doing that. And sometimes there'll be more and sometimes less looking at the chat. And often I will intend to look at it more than I did and not get to it. But fun stuff all around. Janine says, I always appreciate the extra time with David when he talks longer than expected. Bonus. Yeah, there's a certain philosophy toward making videos or webinars like this where you try to short bite-sized chunks, but for whatever reasons, I could try to explore them with them myself, but keeping these to like 20 minutes or half an hour at a time and doing more of them doesn't seem as appealing. It's kind of like, I think once we kind of get into it and we're ready and we're focused, might as well go with it for a while. Plus, at least now there might be a time after a while when it's better to do just a shorter amount of time, even just to kind of keep it going, where it's regular every week or something, but for a little bit of time, who knows? Or it'll just keep lasting for a long time, each webinar, but we'll see. I'm open to it all, but for now, I want to get things out also. Again, early on, I'm kind of in a rush to get enough talking done that there's enough out there to help guide people without it being, and I talk about in a kind of morbid way about what if I die. I want to get enough out there that people can carry it on just fine. But there's also another kind of reason, and I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm not unhealthy, and nor do I have any premonitions of death or morbid thoughts or anything like that. But it's just that this stuff is, in my opinion, so important and rare to figure out that I just want to get it out there. But there's another thing, which is I want to get out there enough that people can work on things themselves productively, which I've already done in a sense with you guys over the years. But I'm looking to get something public out there where people can, as soon as possible, get to where they have enough indication of what to do and examples, and just even times like this webinar, sometimes where I was working on things out loud with you, to do things for themselves, right? I want to get things not dependent on me in kind of an overall sense, and then also on an individual sense for each of you, where I can benefit, I can and will benefit law of implication, you guys as individuals, the movement as a whole, but without holding it back or being needed in a way that's not helpful. Hi, I listen to you every day. Thank you. I appreciate that, Joseph. You're welcome, Sterling. Welcome, everyone. I stay up all night. Thank you. Appreciate that, Megan. It's amazing that you guys have amazing stamina for this, right? Okay, so my explanation didn't finish working as well. I'm not saying all things have to have a cause, right? Hopefully, if you re-listen to what I said, or maybe you heard it, or maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but thing doesn't really add anything. It seems like it maybe would confuse matters more by talking about what a thing is or isn't. Basically, anything that's contingent, that could be something other than what it is, that has to presumably have a cause. We could delve into that, right? And or a reason. But remember, when people think about causes, they tend to jump to the whole incorrect worldview of the material world, and causes being things like gravity. My understanding of cause is everything is actually caused by God, because everything is ultimately made up. Have you heard me talk about this? Of either consciousness, like the whole everything in existence is one of the following things: your consciousness screens, beings like you and me, who are beings aware of consciousness screens, but not our body. God, and reasons that encompasses your mind, the external world, the physical world, all that. Literally, those are the only four things that exist in existence. Again, God, beings like us that are aware of conscious fields and have a bit of free will, or at least in practice we can figure out that we do if we do have free will, but at least they're capable of being aware of conscious screens, beings, conscious screens, and reasons. And everything we think of as the physical world is lies in the world of reasons. It's made of reasons. Like matter is composed of reasons. Your mind is composed of reasons fundamentally. And then we have models of matter that work as representations of those reasons. But matter is not fundamentally made up of molecules and atoms and subatomic particles. Those are useful models that might very accurately reflect the reasons that God has in mind, so to speak. But they're literally made of reasons ultimately. Your mind, your body, the physical world, and so forth are literally made of reasons, just like a computer game world is literally made of, or maybe not just like, but pretty damn close to just like a computer game world is literally made of code in a certain sense, or nearly literally made. Whenever you start making parallels within the world to God overall, they break down on a certain pretty fast on a certain level, but there's still some overlap where it can help us to see. So comparing a computer to God has inherent flaws that are real in terms of thinking, but it can give us but aspects of it hold true in terms of the comparison. So, but aspects don't. So at least helps a little bit. Okay, guys, gave a little bit of extra time to that. Hopefully that helped. Wow, that's awesome, guys. Wonderful. Have a wonderful week. It'll be Fletch next week with discussion, I believe, as long as he confirms that. And then I'll be back the week after that. And then I'm thinking of doing 2 weeks in a row after that, and then maybe skipping a week, but we'll see. But I enjoyed this week a lot, and I was looking forward to it a lot. I wanted to get back on the mic after skipping, so to speak, after skipping Valentine's Day. Take care all. Have a wonderful week and 2 weeks.